Welcome back to another episode of Infidelity Tales Lab. We're thankful for your continued viewership. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing our global reach. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Performance. The Ashford Estates grand ballroom sparkled under crystal chandeliers as guests filled the ornate space. Gideon Hale adjusted his charcoal gray suit and surveyed the scene with the calculating eyes of a former Army intelligence officer. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. His daughter, Ivy, looked radiant in her flowing white gown, dancing with her new husband, Riley Patterson, a decent young man from a good family. The 23-year-old had inherited her mother's striking features, but thankfully possessed her father's sharp intellect. Gideon had spent considerable effort ensuring this wedding would be perfect, though not for the reasons most fathers would. "Dad, the photographer wants family shots." 17-year-old Finn appeared at his elbow, his sandy hair still somehow disheveled despite multiple attempts to tame it for the occasion. "In a moment," Gideon replied, his piercing blue eyes scanning the crowd until they found their target. There she was, Celeste, his wife of 25 years, resplendent in midnight blue silk, playing the role of devoted mother and wife to perfection. She was currently speaking with the Patterson family, her melodious laugh carrying across the room as she charmed them with stories about Ivy's childhood. What the guests didn't know was that Mrs. Celeste Hale had been carrying on an affair for 8 months with Brock Valdez, Gideon's former business partner and supposed best friend. What Celeste didn't know was that Gideon had discovered their betrayal 3 months ago and had been orchestrating this elaborate trap ever since. The Ashford estate wasn't just a picturesque venue. Gideon had purchased it outright 6 weeks ago through a shell company. Every vendor, every staff member, every security detail was now under his control. The wedding wasn't just a celebration. It was the stage for the most carefully planned operation of his civilian life. "Mr. Hale?" The photographer, a nervous young man named Wesley, approached with his camera. "For the family portraits?" "Of course." Gideon smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "Celeste, darling, time for pictures." As his wife glided over, Gideon noticed Brock lingering near the bar, his tall frame and silver-touched temples making him easily identifiable among the guests. The 48-year-old architect had been invited as a family friend, naturally. After all, who would suspect the man who'd stood as best man at their own wedding would be sleeping with the bride? The photographer positioned them on the marble steps leading to the garden terrace. Ivy and Riley in the center, flanked by both sets of parents, with Finn standing slightly apart, a detail Gideon had specifically requested. "Beautiful family," Wesley murmured, adjusting his lens. "You must be so proud." "Indeed," Gideon replied, his arm around Celeste's waist. She felt tense beneath his touch, probably worried about maintaining appearances. If only she knew how unnecessary her performance had become. As the photographer's flash illuminated their faces, Gideon's phone buzzed with a text from his security coordinator. Phase 1 complete. All systems operational. The real show was about to begin. After the photos, guests began filtering toward the dining room for the reception dinner. Gideon had spared no expense. A 7-course meal prepared by a renowned chef, wine from his private collection, entertainment that would keep everyone engaged and, more importantly, present for what was to come. "This is incredible, Dad," Ivy whispered, squeezing his arm as they walked. "Thank you for making this so special." Gideon's heart clenched. His daughter was innocent in all this, and he'd worked tirelessly to ensure her happiness wouldn't be collateral damage in his war against betrayal. "You deserve nothing less, sweetheart." As the evening progressed, Gideon played his part flawlessly, the proud father, the generous host, the devoted husband. He gave a heartfelt speech about family, love, and the importance of trust that had half the room in tears. Celeste watched him with something resembling guilt flickering in her green eyes, while Brock shifted uncomfortably at his table. They had no idea that every word, every gesture, every moment was being recorded by professionally hidden cameras throughout the venue. The audio equipment was military-grade, capable of picking up whispered conversations from across the room. Everything would be captured in pristine detail. "Dad, We have to leave. Now. Finn's urgent whisper cut through Gideon's satisfaction. His son had appeared beside him during the dessert course, his face pale and tight with concern. What's wrong? Gideon kept his voice level, though internally his mind raced through potential complications. I'll explain in the car. Something in Finn's tone, a mixture of fear and determination that reminded Gideon of his own younger self, made him reassess. His son wasn't given to dramatics or panic. If Finn said they needed to leave, there was a reason. Gideon made his excuses quietly, claiming a sudden headache, and followed Finn toward the exit. As they walked past the head table, he caught Celeste's questioning look and offered a reassuring smile. Just getting some air with Finn. Back a moment. The drive home was conducted in tense silence. Finn's hands clenched in his lap as he stared out the window of Gideon's black Mercedes. The family estate was only 15 minutes from the venue, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, as they pulled into the circular driveway of their Georgian mansion, Finn turned to face his father. You really didn't notice? His voice cracked slightly. Notice what? Finn took a shaky breath. The real purpose of that wedding wasn't celebrating Ivy's marriage, was it? It was your trap for Mom and Brock. And tonight, he paused, struggling with the words. Tonight, you were going to destroy them in front of everyone. Gideon's blood ran cold. How had his 17-year-old son pieced together his carefully guarded plan? But that's not the worst part, Dad. Finn's eyes, so much like his own, held a pain that made Gideon's chest tighten. I think they know. And they've been planning something too. Chapter 2. The Architect of Betrayal. 3 months earlier, Gideon Hale had been a man content with his carefully constructed life. His security consulting firm, built on the foundation of his military intelligence background, had grown into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. His marriage to Celeste, though not passionate, had seemed stable. His children were thriving. Ivy engaged to a good man, Finn excelling in his senior year of high school. Then came a night that changed everything. Gideon had returned early from a business trip to Chicago, eager to surprise Celeste for their anniversary. The house had been dark except for a soft glow from their bedroom window. He'd climbed the stairs quietly, planning to slip into bed beside his wife, when he heard voices. Not just Celeste's voice. Brock's. Through the crack in the door, Gideon had watched his wife of 25 years and his closest friend of 30 years locked in an embrace that spoke of months, not moments, of intimacy. Their conversation afterward had been even more damning. Discussions of a future together, of dealing with Gideon, of liquidating assets, and starting fresh somewhere far away. But it was Brock's final comment that had sealed both their fates. Don't worry, darling. I've been documenting his business dealings for months. When the time comes, we'll have enough to destroy him financially and legally. He'll be too busy fighting criminal charges to come after us. Gideon had retreated to his study that night, his mind switching into the tactical mode that had made him legendary in Army intelligence. By morning, he had the framework of a plan that would make their betrayal seem like child's play compared to his response. The beauty of Gideon's approach lay in its patience and precision. Instead of confronting them immediately, he begun his own careful documentation. Private investigators, financial audits, background checks. He'd used every resource at his disposal to build an unassailable case against them both. What he discovered had exceeded even his worst expectations. Brock hadn't just been stealing architectural plans and client lists from their shared projects. He'd been systematically undermining Gideon's business relationships, spreading carefully crafted rumors about Gideon's reliability and ethics. 3 major contracts had been lost in the past year due to Brock's sabotage, each one redirected to Brock's own newly established firm. Celeste, meanwhile, had been far from the passive accomplice Gideon had initially assumed. Her family's old money connections and social influence had been weaponized against him. She'd been poisoning relationships within their social circle, setting the stage for Gideon's eventual downfall while positioning herself as the wronged wife of an increasingly unstable and aggressive husband. They'd been planning to frame him for corporate espionage, using forged documents that Brock had been crafting for months. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Celeste would file for divorce, citing mental cruelty and financial impropriety, while Brock would provide the evidence of Gideon's supposed crimes to federal investigators. But they'd underestimated their target. Gideon's military background wasn't just in intelligence. He'd been a strategic operations officer specializing in psychological warfare. He understood better than most that the most devastating defeats came not from brute force, but from turning an enemy's own momentum against them, which brought him to Ivy's wedding. The event had been planned long before Gideon discovered the affair, but it provided the perfect opportunity for his counterattack. Every detail had been repurposed to serve his larger strategy. The guest list hadn't just been about celebrating Ivy's marriage. It included every person whose opinion mattered in their professional and social circles. The venue's security system wasn't just for protection, it was for documentation. Every conversation, every interaction, every moment of the evening would be recorded and preserved. When the trap was sprung, there would be no possibility of denial or misdirection. The timing wasn't coincidental either. Brock and Celeste had planned to make their move immediately after the wedding, using the emotional stress of Ivy's departure from home as cover for their accusations about Gideon's mental state. They'd calculated that his attachment to his daughter would make him vulnerable and irrational. They were right about his attachment to Ivy. They were catastrophically wrong about how that attachment would manifest. Now, sitting in his study at 2 a.m. after fleeing the wedding reception, Gideon tried to process Finn's revelation. His son sat across from him, having changed out his formal, wearing jeans and a hoodie, looking far older than his 17 years. "How long have you known?" Gideon asked quietly. "About Mom and Brock?" "Since last Christmas," Finn replied, his voice steady despite the pain in his eyes. "I came home early from Jake's house and saw them together in the kitchen. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but then I started paying attention. And my plans?" Finn's smile was grim and disturbingly familiar. "Dad, you taught me to observe, remember? When you bought the Ashford estate through Meridian Holdings LLC, when you hired 3 times the normal security staff, when you started asking me detailed questions about photography angles and sound acoustics." He shrugged. "It wasn't hard to figure out you were planning something big." Gideon felt a mixture of pride and concern. His youngest child had inherited more than just his analytical mind. He'd inherited his capacity for strategic thinking. "So what did you see tonight that made us leave?" Finn pulled out his phone and showed Gideon a series of text messages. "I've been monitoring Mom's communications for weeks. Look at the timestamps." The messages were between Celeste and someone listed as legal. The conversation, beginning just hours before the wedding, detailed an emergency injunction that had been prepared, along with federal warrants based on the fabricated evidence Brock had compiled. They weren't planning to wait until after the wedding, Finn explained. They were going to have you arrested tonight at Ivy's reception in front of everyone. Maximum humiliation and chaos. Gideon's blood turned to ice. The timing would have been perfect from their perspective. His attempted revenge broadcast live as evidence of his unhinged mental state, while federal agents hauled him away in handcuffs before a room full of witnesses. "But here's the thing, Dad," Finn continued, his eyes hardening. "I may have inherited your tactical mind, but I also learned something else from you. When someone betrays your family, you don't just defeat them. You make sure they can never threaten anyone you love ever again." "Finn, no, listen. While you've been planning your elaborate psychological warfare, I've been working on something more direct." Finn's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Remember how you always said the best defense is turning your enemy's weapons against them?" Gideon nodded slowly. "Well, all those forged documents Brock created to frame you, I've had copies for months. And all those business relationships Mom poisoned, I've been documenting every lie, every manipulation, every piece of their conspiracy." Finn leaned forward. "But more importantly, I know something they don't, which is, Brock's been stealing more than just your business secrets. He's been embezzling from his own clients, using the same shell companies he set up to frame you. And Mom's been helping him launder the money through her family's charitable foundation." The pieces clicked into place in Gideon's mind. "You have proof. Dad, I have enough proof to put them both away for decades. The question is, Do you want to just humiliate them, or do you want to destroy them completely? For the first time since discovering the affair, Gideon smiled with genuine pleasure. His son wasn't just brilliant, he was ruthless. The apple hadn't fallen far from the tree. Tell me everything. Chapter 3. The Son's Gambit. As dawn broke over the Hale estate, father and son sat surrounded by the evidence of the most comprehensive counterintelligence operation either had ever witnessed. Finn's laptop displayed multiple windows, financial records, communication logs, photographic evidence, and a complex timeline that would make a federal prosecutor weep with joy. Jesus, Finn, Gideon breathed, scrolling through bank statements that showed a pattern of fund transfers spanning 2 years. How did you get access to Brock's private accounts? His son's expression was carefully neutral. Remember when you sent me to that cybersecurity camp last summer? Turns out I have a talent for digital archaeology. You hacked him. I prefer conducted unauthorized penetration testing of inadequately secured systems. Finn replied with a straight face that reminded Gideon painfully of his own younger self. The man uses his daughter's birthday as his password for everything. It was practically begging to be discovered. Gideon studied his son with new eyes. At 17, Finn had somehow managed to uncover a criminal conspiracy that had eluded Gideon's professional investigators. More importantly, he'd done it while maintaining the appearance of a typical teenager going about his normal life. The foundation money, Gideon said, pulling up another document. How much are we talking about? The Whitmore Foundation has been Mom's family's pet project for 3 generations, Finn explained. Cancer research, children's hospitals, scholarship programs, all legitimate on the surface. But look at the expenditure reports from the last 18 months. Gideon scanned the figures, his trained eye immediately spotting the irregularities. Consulting fees. To companies that don't exist. Brock Shells. He invoices the foundation for architectural services that were never rendered. The foundation pays the invoices, and the money gets cycled through 3 different holding companies before landing in an account in the Cayman Islands. Finn pulled up another screen. But here's where it gets interesting. The next document made Gideon's blood pressure spike. It was a property deed for a beachfront villa in Costa Rica, purchased 6 months ago under the name of one of Brock's shell companies. They've been planning this escape route for longer than I thought, Gideon murmured. It gets better, or worse, depending on your perspective. Finn clicked through to a series of emails. Mom's been moving money out of your joint accounts in small increments, always staying just below the amounts that would trigger automatic reporting. She's been claiming it's for wedding expenses and household items. How much? For $100,000 so far. All of it sitting in an account that only she can access, waiting to be transferred to their Costa Rica nest egg. Gideon leaned back in his chair, processing the full scope of their betrayal. It wasn't just infidelity or even simple theft. It was a sophisticated, long-term operation designed to systematically destroy his life while funding theirs. There's more, Finn said quietly. And this is the part that really pisses me off. He pulled up a series of documents from the Foundation's files, grant applications, and recipient lists. The Children's Cancer Ward at St. Mary's Hospital. The one where they held that big fundraiser last year. The one Mom gave that speech about children deserving hope and fighting for their futures. Gideon remembered. Celeste had been genuinely moved that night, or so he'd thought. She'd spoken eloquently about protecting the innocent and ensuring that children had the resources they needed to survive and thrive. The grant was approved for $2 million, Finn continued, his voice tight with anger. But only $600,000 actually made it to the hospital. The rest was diverted through Brock's shells. Son of a bitch, Gideon whispered. Stealing from him was one thing. Stealing from dying children was another entirely. The scholarship program for underprivileged kids? Same thing. The domestic violence shelter that Mom chairs the board for? Same thing. Finn's hands were shaking slightly as he clicked through document after document. They've been stealing from cancer patients, abused women, and kids who just want a chance at college. Also, they could fund their little love nest in paradise. The tactical part of Gideon's mind was already working through the implications. This wasn't just personal anymore. It was criminal on a scale that would destroy them both completely. The evidence Finn had compiled wouldn't just ruin their reputations or cost them their freedom. It would obliterate any possibility of sympathy from friends, family, or the public. How did you know to look into the foundation? Gideon asked. Finn's expression darkened. Because 3 months ago, Mom asked me to write a college application essay about making a difference in the world. She suggested I write about the foundation's work and how it inspired me to want to help others. The irony was sickeningly perfect. Celeste had wanted their son to use her theft from charity as the basis for his college applications, essentially making Finn an unknowing accomplice in her crimes. I started researching the foundation's actual impact for the essay, Finn continued. When the numbers didn't add up, I dug deeper. That's when I found the discrepancies, which led me to the shell companies, which led me to Brock. And you've been sitting on this for months? I needed to be sure, and I needed to understand the full scope before doing anything irreversible. Finn met his father's eyes. I also needed to figure out whether you were planning to just get even or if you were planning to make sure they could never hurt anyone again. Gideon considered the question carefully. His original plan had been focused on public humiliation and financial damage, a psychological victory that would satisfy his need for revenge while keeping his own hands relatively clean. But the evidence of their theft from charity changed the equation entirely. They stole from dying children, Finn. Yeah, they did. And they were planning to have me arrested at Ivy's wedding. In front of 300 guests, including every business and social contact that matters to our family. Gideon's jaw tightened. The scope of their betrayal went beyond anything he'd imagined. This wasn't just about replacing him with Brock. It was about completely destroying his life, his reputation, and his relationship with his children while simultaneously stealing from the most vulnerable people in society. What's your recommendation? Finn pulled up one final document. A comprehensive plan that would have impressed Gideon's old commanding officers at the Pentagon. We give them exactly what they've been working toward, Finn said calmly. We let them think they've won. We let them make their move, arrest you, humiliate you publicly, and take everything you've built. That sounds like surrender, not victory. It sounds like setting the perfect trap. Finn's smile was predatory, because while they're celebrating their triumph, the FBI will be receiving a comprehensive package detailing their theft from federal tax-exempt charities. The IRS will be getting documentation of tax evasion and money laundering. And the media will be getting the complete story of how a prominent socialite and respected architect systematically stole millions from cancer patients and abused women. Gideon began to see the elegance of his son's approach. Public perception. Exactly. If we strike first, we look vindictive and potentially unstable. Exactly what they're trying to portray. But if we let them destroy you first, and then the evidence comes out. Finn shrugged. Suddenly, you're not a bitter husband getting revenge. You're the victim of a massive criminal conspiracy who is being framed to cover up theft from dying children. The timing would have to be perfect. I've already worked that out. The federal agencies get their packages Monday morning, 48 hours after your arrest. The media gets theirs Tuesday, once the agencies have had time to verify the initial evidence. By Wednesday, Mom and Brock go from being the victims of your unhinged revenge plot to being the subjects of a federal criminal investigation. Gideon studied the timeline his son had prepared. It was sophisticated, thorough, and utterly ruthless. More importantly, it would work. There's one problem, Gideon said slowly. If they arrest me tonight, I won't be in a position to protect you or Ivy from the fallout. Dad, Finn said quietly, I'm not planning to need protection. I'm planning to be the one who brings them down. Something in his son's tone made Gideon look up sharply. Finn's expression held a cold determination that was both impressive and deeply concerning. What aren't you telling me? Finn hesitated for the first time since they'd begun their conversation. There's something else. Something that changes everything. He pulled up a final folder on his laptop. One labeled simply insurance. What is it? Proof that they weren't planning to just frame you and disappear, Finn said quietly. They were planning to make sure you could never come after them. Ever. The documents that appeared on screen made Gideon's blood run cold. Medical records, insurance policies, and a series of communications with what appeared to be a private medical facility in Switzerland. They were going to have you declared mentally incompetent, Finn explained, his voice tight with anger. The criminal charges were just the first step. Once you were arrested and your mental breakdown was established, Mom was going to have you committed to a private psychiatric facility where Brock has connections. Indefinitely. The full scope of their plan hit Gideon like a physical blow. They weren't just planning to steal his money and disappear. They were planning to steal his life, his freedom, and his sanity. He would have been trapped in a foreign psychiatric facility while they lived off stolen charity money, probably for the rest of his life. That changes things, Gideon said quietly. Yeah, it does. Because attempted kidnapping and conspiracy to commit fraud against a federal tax-exempt organization aren't just civil matters. They're federal crimes with no statute of limitations. Finn closed the laptop and looked at his father directly. So I'll ask you again, Dad. Do you want to just humiliate them? Or do you want to make sure they never threaten anyone you love ever again? Gideon's answer was immediate and absolute. I want them destroyed. Good, Finn said, standing up. Because I've already put the first phase into motion. In about 6 hours, Mom and Brock are going to walk into the biggest trap of their lives. Chapter 4, The Trap Springs. By 9 a.m. Sunday morning, the Hale household appeared to have returned to normal post-wedding tranquility. Gideon sat in his study, ostensibly reviewing quarterly reports while actually monitoring the surveillance feeds Finn had established throughout the house. Celeste moved through her morning routine with the practiced grace of someone who had no idea her entire world was about to collapse. Coffee, darling, she asked, appearing in his doorway with a porcelain cup and her most winning smile. You seemed so stressed last night when you and Finn left early. I hope everything's all right. Just a migraine, Gideon replied, accepting the coffee without looking up from his laptop. You know how I get when there's too much noise and stimulation. It was a perfect setup line, and Celeste took it exactly as Finn had predicted she would. You have been under a lot of pressure lately, she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. The Miller contract falling through, the issues with the Patterson project timeline. Sometimes I worry that you're pushing yourself too hard. Each word was carefully chosen, Gideon realized. She was laying the groundwork for the mental instability narrative that would justify his upcoming arrest and commitment. Every expression of concern was actually evidence being planted for future use. Perhaps you should consider taking some time off, Celeste continued. Maybe see Dr. Carrington again? You always said he helped you work through your stress after you left the military. Dr. Carrington, Gideon knew from Finn's research, was now affiliated with the Swiss facility where they planned to have him committed. Another piece of their long-term strategy. I'll consider it, he said mildly. Right now, I just want to focus on making sure Ivy and Riley are settled in their new place. Of course, you're such a devoted father. Celeste's smile was warm and seemingly genuine. That's one of the things I've always loved about you. The sheer audacity of her performance was almost admirable. In less than 12 hours, she was planning to have him arrested and imprisoned, yet she could sit there speaking of love with perfect sincerity. Gideon's phone buzzed with a text from Finn. Be arriving in 30. Phase 1 ready. I should let you get back to work, Celeste said, rising gracefully. Brock is coming by to discuss the Patterson project revisions. I hope you don't mind. I invited him to stay for lunch since he helped so much with the wedding preparations. Of course not, Gideon replied. He's always welcome here. As she left, Gideon opened the secure application Finn had installed on his phone. Multiple camera feeds showed different angles of the house, all recording in high definition with military-grade audio. Whatever happened in the next few hours would be documented with courtroom-quality precision. Brock arrived precisely on schedule, his silver Mercedes pulling into the circular driveway with the confidence of a man who believed victory was assured. He wore casual weekend attire, khakis and a polo shirt, but Gideon noticed the expensive briefcase and the slight tension in his shoulders. The man was preparing for war, not a friendly business discussion. Through the surveillance feed, Gideon watched Celeste greet Brock in the foyer with what appeared to be a casual hug between old friends. But the embrace lasted a fraction too long, and their whispered conversation was picked up clearly by the audio equipment. Is everything ready? Celeste asked. The warrants are signed, Brock confirmed. Agent Morrison will be here at 2 p.m. with the federal task force. The timing is perfect. Sunday afternoon, quiet neighborhood, minimal witnesses until we want them. And the commitment papers? Dr. Carrington is standing by. Once Gideon's arrested and the evidence of his mental breakdown is established, we'll have 72 hours to get him transferred to the facility in Switzerland. Gideon's jaw tightened. Even knowing what was coming, hearing them discuss his kidnapping so casually was enraging. What about the children? Celeste asked. Ivy's on her honeymoon, completely unreachable for the next 2 weeks. By the time she finds out what happened, it'll be too late for her to interfere. And Finn, Brock shrugged. He's 17. His testimony won't matter against federal evidence and medical expert opinion. They had no idea that Finn was currently in position in his bedroom, monitoring their conversation and coordinating with contacts that would have impressed Gideon's old Pentagon colleagues. The money. Celeste's voice held a note of anxiety. Already transferred. As soon as Gideon's arrested, we implement the contingency plan. You file for emergency divorce proceedings claiming mental cruelty and fraud. I provide the business evidence, and we're on a plane to Costa Rica within 48 hours. And if he tries to fight the charges? Brock's laugh was coldly confident. Darling, the man will be in a padded room in Switzerland within a week. He won't be fighting anything. Gideon had heard enough. He activated the secure comm system Finn had established and sent a simple message, green light. The next phase of their counter-operation began immediately. In his bedroom, Finn initiated a series of digital transmissions that had been prepared weeks in advance. The first package went to FBI agent Sarah Chun, head of the Federal Task Force investigating charity fraud. The second went to IRS Criminal Investigation Division. The third went to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Each package contained the complete evidence of Brock and Celeste's criminal enterprise, along with a detailed analysis of their ongoing conspiracy to frame Gideon. But more importantly, each package included real-time surveillance footage of the conversation that had just taken place in the Hale foyer. The timing was critical. The federal agencies would receive evidence of the conspiracy just minutes before the corrupted task force arrived to arrest Gideon. When Agent Morrison and his team arrived with their fabricated warrants, they would walk into a situation that had already been reported to federal oversight. Gideon, Celeste's voice called from downstairs. Could you join us in the living room? Brock has some concerns about the Patterson project that require your input. It was time for the performance of his life. Gideon descended the stairs to find Brock standing near the fireplace, his briefcase open on the coffee table. Several documents were spread across the surface, the fabricated evidence that was meant to support the criminal charges. Brock, Gideon said pleasantly, I hope you're not working too hard on a Sunday. Just trying to clean up some discrepancies in the project files. Brock replied with practiced ease. There seemed to be some irregularities in the financial reporting that I wanted to discuss with you before they became a larger issue. The irony was perfect. The man who had been systematically embezzling from children's charities was accusing Gideon of financial irregularities. What kind of discrepancies? Gideon asked, settling into his usual chair. Brock launched into a detailed explanation of the fabricated evidence, each accusation carefully crafted to paint Gideon as mentally unstable and criminally negligent. Client funds allegedly misappropriated, project specifications allegedly altered for personal gain, business partnerships allegedly manipulated through fraud and intimidation. It was, Gideon had to admit, a masterful frame job. If he hadn't known the truth, he might have been convinced by the documentation Brock presented. These are serious allegations, Gideon said when Brock finished his presentation. I'm afraid they are, Brock replied with false regret, which is why I felt obligated to report them to the appropriate authorities. You reported me to federal investigators? I had no choice, Gideon. As your business partner, I could have been held criminally liable if I'd failed to report suspected fraud. Celeste moved to stand behind Gideon's chair, placing her hands on his shoulders in a gesture that appeared supportive but felt like the closing of a trap. We're here for you, darling, she said softly. Whatever happens, we'll get through this together. I've already spoken to Dr. Carrington about helping you work through this crisis. The setup was perfect. When the federal agents arrived, they would find Gideon confronted with evidence of his crimes, supported by his concerned wife and business partner, clearly in need of psychological intervention. What they didn't know was that every word of their conversation was being transmitted in real time to the actual FBI task force investigating charity fraud. Gideon's phone buzzed with a text from Finn, cavalry inbound. ETA 10 minutes. You know, Gideon said conversationally, I've always admired your strategic thinking, Brock. This is really quite an elegant operation. Something in his tone made Brock's eyes narrow slightly. I'm not sure what you mean. The long-term planning, the attention to detail, the way you've coordinated multiple moving pieces into a single, devastating attack. Gideon smiled pleasantly. If I didn't know better, I'd say you learned psychological warfare from a professional. Gideon, Celeste said carefully, you're starting to sound a bit paranoid. Am I? Or am I just finally seeing the situation clearly? He stood up, moving to the window that overlooked the front drive. Tell me, Brock, when did you first decide that framing me for charity fraud would be more profitable than simply stealing my business? The color drained from Brock's face. I have no idea what you're talking about. The Whitmore Foundation, St. Mary's Children's Cancer Ward, the Domestic Violence Shelter, the Scholarship Program. Gideon turned back to face them, his expression cold and predatory. Did you really think I wouldn't eventually notice that my wife's family charity was being systematically looted? Celeste's mask finally slipped, her carefully maintained composure cracking to reveal something desperate and dangerous underneath. You can't prove anything, she said quietly. Can I? Gideon pulled out his phone and showed them the surveillance application. Every word you've spoken in this house for the past 3 months has been recorded. Every transaction, every communication, every planning session for your little Costa Rica retirement plan. Brock lunged for his briefcase, probably reaching for a weapon, but froze when he heard the unmistakable sound of vehicles pulling into the driveway. Through the window, Gideon could see a convoy of black SUVs surrounding the house. Not the small task force that Brock had arranged, but a full federal response team. That would be the real FBI, Gideon said pleasantly. I believe they have some questions about missing charity funds and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. As federal agents surrounded the house, Gideon's phone buzzed with a final message from Finn. Welcome to the trap, Mom. Hope you enjoy your stay. Chapter 5, The Unraveling. The next 30 minutes unfolded with the precision of a military operation. Agent Sarah Chun, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, entered the living room flanked by 6 federal agents while additional teams secured the perimeter and began executing search warrants throughout the house. Mr. Valdez, Mrs. Hale, Agent Chun announced, you are both under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud against federal tax-exempt organizations, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. Brock's face went ashen as Agent Chun continued reading their rights. Celeste, however, immediately shifted into survival mode, her socialite training kicking in to provide a believable performance of confused innocence. Agent Chun, there must be some mistake, Celeste said with perfect bewilderment. We were just discussing some business concerns with my husband. If there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Ma'am, we have documented evidence of your participation in a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme targeting charitable organizations, Agent Chun replied calmly. We also have audio and video surveillance of you and Mr. Valdez discussing plans to have your husband falsely arrested and committed to a foreign psychiatric facility. That stopped Celeste cold. Her eyes darted to Gideon, who maintained an expression of careful neutrality even as satisfaction coursed through his veins. The surveillance in this house, Agent Chun continued, has been gathering evidence for federal investigators for the past 6 weeks. Every conversation, every planning session, every detail of your conspiracy has been documented. Brock found his voice at last. This is entrapment. Gideon set us up. Actually, Mr. Valdez, Agent Chun replied with a slight smile. Mr. Hale has been cooperating with our investigation since we received credible evidence of charity fraud in February. The surveillance operation was conducted under proper federal warrants as part of an ongoing criminal investigation. It was a beautiful lie, perfectly crafted to explain how the evidence had been gathered legally while protecting Finn's more questionable methods. The truth was that Finn had made contact with Agent Chin only 3 hours ago, but the fabricated timeline would hold up in court. "Where's the boy?" Brock demanded suddenly, his composure finally cracking completely. "Where's Finn? He's the one who's been spying on us, isn't he?" As if summoned by his name, Finn appeared in the doorway of the living room. But he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a man in his 50s wearing a Navy uniform with the insignia of a rear admiral. "Admiral Crawford," Gideon said, snapping unconsciously to attention. "I wasn't expecting you, sir." "At ease, Colonel," Admiral Crawford replied, using Gideon's old military rank. "Your son contacted the Office of Naval Intelligence yesterday with some rather disturbing intelligence about a conspiracy involving military contractors and federal crimes." Finn's coup de grace was revealed. He hadn't just gathered evidence of charity fraud. He discovered that Brock's architectural firm had been working on classified military construction projects, and the same shell companies used to launder charity money had also been used to inflate costs on federal defense contracts. "Mr. Valdez," Admiral Crawford continued, "your firm has been billing the Department of Defense for materials and services that were never provided. The financial forensics team estimates the total fraud at approximately $12 million over 3 years." Brock's legs gave out, and he sank into the nearest chair. Military contractor fraud carried penalties that would ensure he spent the rest of his life in federal prison. "Agent Chun," Admiral Crawford said formally, "I'm invoking joint federal jurisdiction on this matter. This is now a combined civilian-military criminal investigation." As federal agents began collecting evidence throughout the house, Celeste made one last desperate play. She turned to Gideon with tears streaming down her face. Whether genuine or performed, he couldn't tell. "Gideon, please," she whispered. "We've been married for 25 years. We have children together. Surely there's some way we can work this out privately." For a moment, looking at his wife's tear-stained face, Gideon felt an echo of the man he'd been 6 months ago, the man who might have been willing to forgive, to find a way forward that preserved their family. Then he remembered the children's cancer ward, the domestic violence shelter, the scholarship fund, the families whose lives had been damaged by Celeste and Brock's greed. "No," he said quietly, "there isn't." Agent Chin's team worked with methodical efficiency, collecting computers, financial records, and communication devices. The evidence was overwhelming, years of financial crimes documented in meticulous detail, thanks to Finn's digital archaeology and the real-time surveillance of their final planning session. "Mr. Hale," Agent Chin said as her team prepared to transport the prisoners, "we'll need you and your son to come to the federal building tomorrow morning for complete debriefing. The scope of this conspiracy appears to be larger than we initially suspected." "Of course," Gideon replied. "We're fully committed to assisting with the investigation." As the federal convoy departed with Celeste and Brock in custody, Gideon and Finn stood in the suddenly quiet foyer of their home. The silence felt strange after months of careful planning and the morning's dramatic conclusion. "How did you make contact with Admiral Crawford?" Gideon asked. Finn's grin was pure pride. "Remember General Morrison from your old unit? He's Admiral Crawford's chief of staff now. When I explained what we'd uncovered about the defense contractor fraud, he arranged the meeting. And you figured out the military connection how. Brock's been billing the Pentagon for premium materials while actually using substandard supplies," Finn explained. "The cost difference went into the same accounts as the charity money. It was just another revenue stream for their Costa Rica fund." Gideon shook his head in amazement. His 17-year-old son had unraveled a criminal conspiracy that involved multiple federal agencies and millions of dollars in stolen funds. "There's something else," Finn said, his expression growing serious. "Something I didn't tell you before." "What?" "The psychiatric facility in Switzerland. The one where they were planning to have you committed." Finn paused. "Dr. Carrington isn't just affiliated with it. He owns it, and it's not a legitimate medical facility." The final piece of their plan became clear. They weren't just planning to have him declared mentally incompetent. They were planning to have him disappeared into a private facility where he could be held indefinitely without oversight or legal recourse. How many others? Gideon asked quietly. At least a dozen over the past 5 years, Finn replied. All wealthy men whose wives wanted to access their assets without the complications of divorce proceedings. The facility doesn't exist in any official medical database. As far as the world would know, you simply vanished. The scope of their criminality was staggering. This wasn't just theft or fraud. It was human trafficking on an international scale. The Admiral's team is coordinating with Interpol, Finn continued. Dr. Carrington and his operation will be shut down within 48 hours. Gideon felt a cold satisfaction settle in his chest. Celeste and Brock hadn't just betrayed him. They'd walked into a trap that would expose a criminal enterprise spanning multiple countries and countless victims. What happens now? Finn asked. Gideon considered the question carefully. With Celeste and Brock in federal custody facing decades in prison, their immediate threat was neutralized. But there would be trials, media attention, and the complex process of unwinding their criminal enterprise. Now we make sure they never hurt anyone again, Gideon replied. And we rebuild our family without the people who tried to destroy it. What about Ivy? That was the one variable that still concerned Gideon. His daughter was on her honeymoon, completely unaware that her mother and godfather had been arrested for federal crimes. The news would devastate her. We tell her the truth, Gideon said finally. All of it. She deserves to know what kind of people she was trusting with her life. Finn nodded solemnly. At 17, he'd learned lessons about betrayal and family loyalty that most people never faced. But he'd also learned that sometimes the only way to protect the people you love is to be willing to destroy the people who threaten them. Dad, Finn said as they headed upstairs to begin the process of contacting lawyers and preparing for the media storm that would inevitably follow. Yeah, I'm glad you never taught me to forgive people who try to hurt our family. Gideon smiled grimly. Some lessons are more important than others, son. Remember that. As they reached the top of the stairs, Gideon's phone buzzed with a text from Admiral Crawford. Carrington facility raided. 12 victims recovered alive. Your intelligence saved lives, Colonel. The trap they'd set had been even more successful than they planned. Celeste and Brock weren't just facing prison. They'd helped expose a criminal network that had been operating internationally for years. It was, Gideon reflected, exactly the kind of comprehensive victory that his enemies deserved. Chapter 6, Scorched Earth. 3 days after the arrests, the media storm had exceeded even Gideon's expectations. The story had everything journalists loved: wealth, betrayal, international conspiracy, and charitable funds stolen from dying children. By Wednesday morning, Celeste and Brock's photos were on the front page of every major newspaper in the country. Gideon sat in his study reviewing the morning's coverage when his lawyer, David Manning, arrived with an update on the legal proceedings. The federal prosecutor is calling it one of the most comprehensive charity fraud cases in history, Manning reported, settling into the chair across from Gideon's desk. Between the domestic embezzlement and the international human trafficking conspiracy, they're looking at charges that could result in multiple life sentences. Good, Gideon replied without emotion. What about the civil implications? That's where things get interesting, Manning continued. The Foundation Board is filing civil suits to recover the stolen funds. But there's also discussion of victim compensation. The families affected by the medical funding shortfalls, the scholarship recipients who lost opportunities, the domestic violence shelter that had to cut services, they're all potential claimants. Gideon had been expecting this. The financial damages from Celeste and Brock's crimes extended far beyond the money they'd stolen. Real people had suffered real consequences because of their greed. What's the potential exposure? Conservative estimate? 40 to 50 million in damages and penalties, Manning replied. Celeste's family foundation is effectively bankrupt, and Brock's assets have been frozen pending the criminal trial. The phone rang, interrupting their discussion. Gideon's caller ID showed it was Ivy, finally returning from her honeymoon. Dad, his daughter's voice was shaky, clearly struggling with the news reports she'd undoubtedly seen. I just got back and saw. I can't believe. Is it true? Come home, sweetheart, Gideon said gently. We need to talk. An hour later, Ivy sat in the same living room where her mother and Brock had been arrested, listening in stunned silence as Gideon and Finn explained the full scope of the conspiracy. Her new husband, Riley, sat beside her, holding her hand as she processed the betrayal of the two people she trusted most outside her immediate family. The Costa Rica house, Ivy said finally. Mom always said it was her dream retirement destination. She made it sound so romantic. She was planning to live there on money stolen from cancer patients, Finn said bluntly, while Dad rotted in a Swiss psychiatric facility. Ivy flinched at his harsh tone, but Gideon noticed she didn't argue with the assessment. His daughter was naive about many things, but she wasn't stupid. What happens to us now? She asked quietly. That depends on what you mean by U.S., Gideon replied carefully. Your mother made choices that have consequences. Those consequences don't have to define your life, but they are real. Will I have to testify? Probably, Manning interjected. The prosecution will want to establish the family dynamics and the extent to which Celeste deceived everyone around her. Ivy's face crumpled, and for a moment she looked like the little girl who used to run to Gideon for comfort after nightmares. But she was a married woman now, with her own life and her own choices to make. I can't visit her in prison, Ivy said through tears. I know that makes me a terrible daughter, but I can't look at her knowing what she did to you and to all those families. That doesn't make you terrible, Gideon said firmly. That makes you someone with a moral compass. Riley spoke for the first time since hearing the full story. What kind of support does your family need right now? Practically speaking, Gideon appreciated his son-in-law's pragmatic approach. The media attention will die down eventually, but this case will probably take years to fully resolve. Ivy's going to be identified as the daughter of the defendants, which could affect her professionally and socially. We'll deal with it, Riley said simply. Ivy's not responsible for her mother's crimes. That afternoon brought another unexpected visitor. Emma Richardson, executive director of the Whitmore Foundation, arrived looking haggard and desperate. Mr. Hale, she began without preamble, I've been trying to reach you for days. The foundation board needs to discuss the succession plan. Gideon frowned. Succession plan? Celeste was the foundation's primary trustee, Richardson explained. With her arrest and the criminal charges, the board needs to appoint a replacement immediately. As her husband and the father of her children, you're the legal heir to her position. The irony was perfect. The foundation that Celeste had looted was now offering him control of its operations. What's the current financial status? Gideon asked. Catastrophic, Richardson admitted. Between the stolen funds and the legal costs, we're looking at bankruptcy within 6 months. The only way to continue operating is if someone with significant resources takes over and commits to restoring the foundation's credibility. Finn looked up from his laptop where he'd been monitoring the ongoing media coverage. Dad, the foundation still has the infrastructure to do real good. All the programs Mom and Brock corrupted, we could actually make them work the way they were supposed to. Gideon considered the proposal. Taking over the foundation would mean committing significant personal resources to repair the damage Celeste had caused. But it would also mean turning her weapon against charity into an actual force for good. I'll need complete control, Gideon said finally. New board, new policies, independent oversight. Whatever you need, Richardson replied eagerly. The alternative is complete dissolution and criminal liability for the board members who failed to detect the fraud. And I want Finn involved in the oversight structure, Gideon continued. He's the one who uncovered the corruption. He should have a voice in preventing it from happening again. That evening, as Gideon and Finn worked through the legal requirements for foundation restructuring, Admiral Crawford called with another update on the international investigation. The Swiss facility raid yielded intelligence on similar operations in 6 other countries, the Admiral reported. Carrington was just one node in a network that's been trafficking wealthy individuals for over a decade. Your wife and Valdez weren't just criminals. They were connected to organized crime on a global scale. The scope of Celeste's betrayal continued to expand. She hadn't just stolen from him and cheated on their marriage. She'd allied herself with international criminals who specialized in making inconvenient people disappear. Any word on their cooperation with the investigation? Gideon asked. Valdez is trying to negotiate a plea deal, but he doesn't have much to offer that we don't already know. Your wife, on the other hand. The Admiral paused. She's maintaining complete silence. Her lawyers are advising a full defense strategy. Gideon wasn't surprised. Celeste had always been stubborn, and she'd probably convinced herself that her social connections and family influence could somehow protect her from the consequences of her actions. How long until trial? Federal cases of this complexity usually take 18 to 24 months to reach court, the Admiral replied. But given the international elements and the number of victims, it could be longer. After the call ended, Gideon found himself alone in his study for the first time since the arrests. The house felt different now, cleaner somehow, as if removing Celeste's presence had eliminated a source of contamination he hadn't fully recognized while it was there. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This isn't over. You destroyed my life, and I'll destroy yours. Watch your back. The message was clearly from someone associated with Celeste or Brock, probably a contact from their criminal network who hadn't been caught in the federal sweep. Gideon forwarded the message to Admiral Crawford and made a note to increase security around the house. Finn appeared in the doorway, as if sensing his father's concern. Everything okay? Just someone who doesn't understand that their war is already over, Gideon replied, showing him the threatening message. Finn's expression hardened. Should we be worried? We should be prepared, Gideon corrected. There's a difference. As father and son began reviewing their security protocols, Gideon reflected on how completely their roles had evolved. Finn was no longer just his son. He was his strategic partner in protecting their family and ensuring that justice was served. Dad, Finn said as they finished their security review, I need to ask you something. What is it? Are you okay with being the kind of man who destroys people who betray him? Gideon considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, he might have struggled with the moral implications of his actions. Now, having seen the full scope of Celeste and Brock's crimes, he felt no such uncertainty. Son, there are people in this world who prey on others, who steal from dying children and plan to make innocent men disappear. Those people don't deserve mercy or forgiveness. They deserve to be stopped permanently. Finn nodded, seeming satisfied with the answer. Besides, Gideon added with a cold smile, I didn't destroy them. I just gave them enough rope to hang themselves. As they prepared for bed, both men understood that their war was far from over. The criminal trials would take years, the civil litigation even longer. There would be appeals, countersuits, and probably more threats from the remnants of the criminal network. But Celeste and Brock had made one fatal miscalculation. They'd assumed that Gideon's love for his family made him vulnerable, when in fact it made him absolutely ruthless. They were about to spend the rest of their lives learning the difference. Chapter 7. The Trial of Betrayal. 18 months later, the federal courthouse in downtown Manhattan had become the epicenter of what media outlets were calling the trial of the decade. The prosecution's case against Celeste Hale and Brock Valdez had grown even stronger as international investigators uncovered additional victims and evidence of their conspiracy. Gideon sat in the gallery behind the prosecution table, watching his wife of 25 years face charges that could result in multiple life sentences. Celeste had aged dramatically during her time in federal custody. Her once pristine appearance now replaced by the hollow-eyed look of someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed entirely. The prosecution calls Finn Hale to the stand, announced Assistant U.S. Attorney Patricia Vance, a veteran prosecutor who had built her career on complex financial crimes. At 19, Finn had grown into a formidable young man whose testimony had been crucial in building the federal case. He walked to the witness stand with the same calm confidence he displayed during the initial investigation, showing no nervousness despite the media attention focused on every word. Mr. Hale, Vance began, please tell the court how you first became aware of your mother's criminal activities. Finn's voice was steady as he recounted discovering the discrepancies in the Foundation's financial records, his methodical investigation of the shell companies, and the gradual realization that his mother and Brock were systematically stealing from charitable organizations. "And what did you do with this information?" "I documented everything," Finn replied. "Every transaction, every communication, every piece of evidence that showed they were stealing money meant to help cancer patients, domestic violence victims, and underprivileged students." Celeste's defense attorney, a prominent white-collar criminal lawyer named Jonathan Pierce, objected to the characterization, but Judge Catherine Morrison overruled him. The evidence of the defendant's crimes was too overwhelming for procedural challenges. "Mr. Hale," Vance continued, "did there come a time when you learned about your mother's plan to have your father falsely arrested and committed to a psychiatric facility in Switzerland?" "Yes. 3 days before my sister's wedding, I intercepted communications between my mother and Dr. Carrington detailing the plan to have my father declared mentally incompetent and transferred to a facility where he could be held indefinitely." The prosecution presented the recorded conversations from the wedding day, playing them for the jury with crystal clarity. Celeste's voice filled the courtroom as she discussed the timing of Gideon's arrest, the fabricated evidence, and the logistics of having him transported to Switzerland. During cross-examination, Pierce attempted to portray Finn as a disturbed teenager who had violated his mother's privacy and possibly fabricated evidence. But Finn's calm, detailed responses and the corroborating physical evidence made Pierce's attacks seem desperate rather than effective. "Mr. Hale," Pierce said during his cross-examination, "isn't it true that you harbor resentment toward your mother because of her relationship with Mr. Valdez?" "No," Finn replied simply. "I harbor resentment toward my mother because she stole money from dying children to fund her retirement with a man who was planning to have my father kidnapped." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and Judge Morrison gavelled for order. "Your Honor," Pierce protested, "the witness is editorializing." "The witness is answering your question, Counselor," Judge Morrison replied dryly. "Proceed." The prosecution's case continued for 3 weeks, with testimony from foundation executives, hospital administrators, scholarship recipients who had lost funding, and FBI agents who had investigated the international trafficking network. Each witness added another layer to the evidence, showing that Celeste and Brock's crimes had affected hundreds of innocent people. Admiral Crawford testified about the military contractor fraud, explaining how Brock had inflated defense contracts while delivering substandard materials to military facilities. The financial forensics expert detailed the complex money laundering scheme that had moved millions of dollars through shell companies to the Costa Rica accounts. But the most devastating testimony came from Dr. Hans Mueller, a former patient at the Swiss facility who had been rescued during the international raid. "I was held there for 3 years," Mueller testified via video link from Germany. "My wife had me committed after claiming I was mentally unstable, but in reality, she wanted access to my pharmaceutical company. Dr. Carrington and his staff used experimental drugs to keep patients disoriented and compliant." Mueller's testimony established that the facility wasn't just fraudulent, it was a human rights violation on an international scale. Celeste hadn't just been planning to steal Gideon's money, she'd been planning to have him tortured. When the prosecution rested, Pierce's defense strategy became clear. He couldn't challenge the evidence of his client's crimes, so he attempted to portray them as victims of Gideon's manipulation. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Pierce said in his opening statement for the defense, "my client Celeste Hale was a woman trapped in an abusive marriage to a man trained in psychological warfare. Everything she did was motivated by fear and desperation, not greed. It was a risky strategy that required Pierce to put Celeste on the stand to testify about alleged abuse that had never been reported to authorities and wasn't supported by any evidence. Celeste's testimony was a masterclass in manipulation. She spoke tearfully about feeling controlled and intimidated by Gideon's military background, claiming that she'd been afraid to leave the marriage directly because of his volatile personality. "I knew he had connections in the intelligence community," she testified. "I was terrified that if I simply filed for divorce, he would use those connections to discredit me or worse." The performance might have been compelling if not for the overwhelming evidence of her crimes and the recorded conversations showing her calculating discussion of having Gideon kidnapped. During cross-examination, Prosecutor Vance systematically dismantled Celeste's victim narrative. "Mrs. Hale, you testified that you were afraid of your husband's reaction to divorce. But you weren't planning to divorce him, were you?" What do you mean?" "You were planning to have him declared mentally incompetent and committed to a foreign psychiatric facility where he could be held indefinitely. That's not divorce, is it?" "I was trying to get him help." "Mrs. Hale, did Dr. Carrington's facility appear in any official medical database?" "I don't know. Were any of the patients at Dr. Carrington's facility there voluntarily?" "I assume." "Mrs. Hale, isn't it true that you weren't trying to escape an abusive marriage, but rather to commit a perfect crime by making your husband disappear while stealing millions of dollars from charitable organizations?" Celeste's composure finally cracked. "He made me do it," she screamed. "Everything was his fault. He was cold and controlling, and he never loved me the way Brock did." The outburst destroyed any sympathy the jury might have felt for her. She just admitted that the entire scheme was motivated by her affair, not by fear or abuse. Brock's testimony was even more disastrous. He attempted to claim that he'd been manipulated by Celeste, portraying himself as a lovesick fool who had been led astray by a seductive woman. But the prosecution's evidence showed that many of the fraudulent schemes had been his ideas, and his military contractor fraud had predated his affair with Celeste by 2 years. "Mr. Valdez," Vance said during cross-examination, "you testified that you were influenced by Mrs. Hale's emotional manipulation. But the evidence shows that you were already defrauding the Department of Defense before you began your affair with her. Isn't that correct?" Those were business decisions. Business decisions to steal from the United States military while providing substandard materials that could have endangered the lives of service members. Brock's attempt to blame Celeste for his crimes fell apart under scrutiny, and his own recorded statements about the Swiss facility plan showed him to be an enthusiastic participant rather than a reluctant accomplice. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Celeste and Brock were convicted of conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and multiple counts of theft from federal tax-exempt organizations. Judge Morrison scheduled sentencing for the following month, but the message was clear. Both defendants would spend the rest of their lives in federal prison. As the verdicts were read, Gideon felt no triumph or satisfaction. Justice had been served, but the cost had been enormous. His children had lost their mother, his family had been destroyed, and hundreds of innocent people had suffered because of Celeste and Brock's greed. Outside the courthouse, Finn stood beside his father as reporters shouted questions about the case and its implications. "How do you feel about your mother's conviction?" one reporter called out. Finn's response was measured and final. "My mother chose to steal from dying children to fund her affair." The jury's verdict reflects the consequences of those choices. As they walked to their car, Gideon realized that his son had learned the most important lesson of all. Loyalty to family meant protecting the innocent, not enabling the guilty. The war was finally over, and they had won. Chapter 8. The Reckoning. The sentencing hearing took place on a cold February morning, exactly 2 years after Gideon had first discovered Celeste's affair. Judge Morrison's courtroom was packed with victims, family members, and media representatives who had followed the case from its explosive beginning to its inevitable conclusion. Celeste sat at the defense table wearing an orange prison jumpsuit, her once immaculate appearance now a shadow of its former self. The woman who had prided herself on her social connections and family influence had been reduced to just another federal prisoner awaiting judgment. Brock appeared equally diminished, his formerly confident demeanor replaced by the hollow resignation of a man who had gambled everything and lost. "Before I impose sentence," Judge Morrison announced, "I will hear from the victims who wish to address the court." The first speaker was Dr. Patricia Williams, Chief of Pediatric Oncology at St. Mary's Hospital. Her voice was steady but filled with controlled anger as she addressed the defendants. "Because of your theft, we were forced to reduce our patient care services by 40%, she said, looking directly at Celeste. Families who were already facing the worst crisis of their lives had to worry about whether their children would receive adequate treatment. Some of our young patients suffered delays in critical care because the funding you stole was money we had counted on to save lives. The impact statements continued for nearly 3 hours. Scholarship recipients who had lost educational opportunities. Domestic violence survivors whose shelter had been forced to turn away women in crisis. Military families whose loved ones had been housed in buildings constructed with substandard materials because of Brock's fraud. Each story added weight to the magnitude of Celeste and Brock's crimes, showing that their betrayal had extended far beyond Gideon's family. I would like to address the court. The voice came from an unexpected source, Emma Richardson, the foundation director who had approached Gideon about taking over the organization. "Your Honor," Richardson said, "I've worked for charitable organizations for 20 years, and I've never seen a case where the criminals showed such complete disregard for the people they were supposed to be helping. Mrs. Hale didn't just steal money. She perverted the very concept of charity, turning an organization dedicated to helping others into a vehicle for her own greed." When the victim statements concluded, Judge Morrison invited the defendants to make final statements before sentencing. Brock's attorney had clearly coached him to express remorse, but his words sounded hollow and rehearsed. He spoke about making poor decisions and being led astray, but never acknowledged the full scope of his crimes or the suffering they had caused. Celeste's statement was more revealing. She maintained that she had been manipulated by both Gideon and Brock, portraying herself as a victim even as she sat convicted of crimes that had harmed hundreds of people. "I never intended for anyone to be hurt," she said tearfully. "I was just trying to find happiness after years of feeling trapped and unloved." The performance might have been moving if not for the recorded evidence of her calculating discussions about having Gideon kidnapped and the systematic nature of her theft from charitable organizations. Judge Morrison's response was swift and devastating. "Mrs. Hale, you have had 2 years to reflect on your actions, yet you continue to blame others for choices that were entirely your own. You stole from cancer patients, abuse victims, and disadvantaged students not because you were trapped or manipulated, but because you valued your own comfort over their suffering." The judge turned to Brock. "Mr. Valdez, your crimes included defrauding the United States military, potentially endangering the lives of service members through the provision of substandard materials. Your betrayal of trust extended beyond personal relationships to your duties as a citizen and contractor." Judge Morrison's sentences reflected the severity of their crimes and the lack of genuine remorse from either defendant. Celeste received 45 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Brock received 50 years, with the additional time reflecting his military contractor fraud. At their ages, both sentences were effectively life terms. Furthermore, Judge Morrison continued, "I am ordering complete asset forfeiture to provide restitution to the victims of your crimes. Every property, investment, and asset connected to your criminal enterprise will be liquidated and distributed to the charitable organizations and individuals you harmed." As the court officers prepare to transport the defendants back to federal custody, Celeste made eye contact with Gideon for the first time during the entire proceedings. Her expression held a mixture of hatred and desperation that revealed the true nature of the woman he had been married to for 25 years. "This isn't over," she mouthed silently. Gideon's response was a slight smile that conveyed absolute indifference to her threats. She had no power left to harm him or his family. Her war was over, and she had lost completely. Outside the courthouse, reporters again pressed for statements from the Hale family. This time, Gideon chose to speak. "Justice was served today," he said simply. "The victims of these crimes can begin the process of healing, knowing that the people who hurt them will never have the opportunity to harm anyone else." "Do you have any final words for your wife?" a reporter asked. Gideon's expression was cold and final. "I have no wife. I have no message for the criminals who were sentenced today. They chose their path, and now they must face the consequences." Later that evening, Gideon and Finn sat in the study where they had first planned their counterattack against Celeste and Brock's conspiracy. The foundation restructuring was complete, and the organization was now funding legitimate charitable work under independent oversight. Any regrets? Finn asked. Gideon considered the question seriously. The past 2 years had been brutal. The investigation, the trial, the media scrutiny, and the destruction of his marriage. But the alternative would have been worse. If we hadn't acted, they would have succeeded, Gideon replied. I would be rotting in a Swiss psychiatric facility while they lived off money stolen from dying children. They would have continued their crimes, harming more victims. So no regrets? None whatsoever. Ivy and Riley arrived for dinner, as they did every Sunday since the trial had ended. Ivy had struggled with her mother's crimes and imprisonment, but she had ultimately chosen to maintain her relationship with her father and brother while cutting all contact with Celeste. The foundation approved funding for the new children's wing at St. Mary's. Ivy reported during dinner. $5 million for state-of-the-art cancer treatment facilities. It was fitting justice. Money that Celeste had stolen from sick children was now being used to provide them with better care than they would have received if she had never committed her crimes. Any word from the parole board? Riley asked. Neither of them is eligible for parole, Finn replied. Federal sentences, over 40 years with no possibility of early release. They'll die in prison. The conversation continued with updates on family life, business matters, and foundation activities. To an outside observer, they appear to be a normal family discussing routine concerns. But Gideon knew they had been forged by fire into something stronger than most families ever achieved. They had faced betrayal from within and emerged united and stronger. They had chosen justice over sentiment, truth over convenience, and protection of the innocent over misplaced loyalty. As the evening wound down and his children prepared to leave, Gideon reflected on the lessons learned through their ordeal. Love without boundaries was not love. It was enabling. Forgiveness without consequences was not mercy. It was injustice. Dad, Finn said as he prepared to leave for his college dorm, I need to tell you something. What is it? I'm proud to be your son. Not because of what we did to them, but because you taught me that protecting innocent people is more important than protecting guilty ones, even when the guilty ones are family. Gideon nodded, understanding that his son had learned the most important lesson a man could learn. That true strength came not from the ability to forgive, but from the wisdom to know when forgiveness would enable further harm. As his family departed and the house settled into quiet, Gideon allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Celeste and Brock would spend the rest of their lives paying for their crimes. The victims they had harmed were receiving restitution and justice. The criminal network they had been part of was dismantled. His phone buzzed with a message from Admiral Crawford. Carrington sentenced to life without parole. Swiss facility victims receiving compensation. Your intelligence saved lives, Colonel. The final piece of justice had been served. The man who would have tortured Gideon in a fake psychiatric facility was now facing his own lifetime imprisonment. Gideon poured himself a glass of whiskey and settled into his chair, finally allowing himself to feel the peace that came with complete victory. He had protected his family, served justice, and ensured that two dangerous criminals would never hurt anyone again. In the end, that was all that mattered. Chapter 9. Legacy of Steel. 5 years after the sentencing, Gideon stood in the boardroom of the restructured Whitmore Foundation, looking out over the city skyline as he prepared for the annual board meeting. The organization had not only recovered from Celeste's crimes, but had grown into one of the most respected charitable institutions in the country. Finn, now 24 and holding a master's degree in forensic accounting, served as the foundation's director of financial oversight, a position created specifically to ensure that no one could ever again manipulate the organization for personal gain. The numbers are impressive, Finn reported to the board. Last year, we distributed $43 million in grants, with overhead costs under 8%. Independent audits confirm that every dollar is being used for its intended purpose. Ivy, now a successful architect in her own right, had joined the board 2 years earlier. She specialized in designing facilities for the organizations the foundation supported, hospitals, shelters, and schools that served vulnerable populations. The new children's hospital in Newark will break ground next month, she announced. The design incorporates every advanced feature available for pediatric cancer treatment, funded entirely by foundation grants. Gideon felt a deep satisfaction as he watched his children carry forward the mission that had emerged from their family's destruction. They had taken the weapon that Celeste had used against Charity and transformed it into a force that would help thousands of people. After the meeting, the three of them walked to lunch at a restaurant near the Foundation's offices. It had become their tradition, a monthly family meal where they discussed both business and personal matters. Any word from the appeals court? Ivy asked as they settled into their table. Final denial last week, Finn replied. Celeste's lawyers exhausted their last option. The conviction and sentence are permanent. Celeste had spent 5 years filing appeals, claiming everything from ineffective counsel to judicial bias. Every appeal had been denied, and she would remain in federal prison until her death. What about Brock? He stopped filing appeals 2 years ago, Gideon said. His health is deteriorating rapidly. The prison doctors don't expect him to live much longer. It was perhaps the final justice. Brock would die in a federal prison medical ward, a fitting end for a man who had planned to profit from others' suffering. Have you thought about what you'll do when the Foundation is fully established? Riley asked Gideon. Their family dinners had expanded to include spouses as the next generation built their own lives. I've had an offer from the State Department, Gideon replied. They want me to head up a new task force investigating international financial crimes, specifically targeting organizations like the Swiss Facility Network. Finn's eyes lit up with interest. That sounds like exactly the kind of work you were meant to do. It would mean travel, probably dangerous assignments, Gideon cautioned, and dealing with criminals who make Celeste and Brock look like amateurs. Dad, Ivy said firmly, you spent 30 years preparing for that kind of work, and the last 5 years proving that you can take down criminal conspiracies that others can't even detect. If anyone can protect innocent people from international predators, it's you. Gideon smiled at his daughter's confidence. She had inherited her mother's determination, but channeled it toward protecting others rather than exploiting them. There's something else, Finn added. The Foundation Board has been discussing establishing an international division. If you take the State Department position, we could coordinate our efforts, legitimate charitable work supported by intelligence operations, against the people who prey on charitable organizations. The idea had merit. Gideon's government work could identify criminal networks, while the Foundation's legitimate operations could provide cover for intelligence gathering and support for victims. We'd be turning Dad into a professional enemy of bad people, Ivy observed with a grin. I've always been an enemy of bad people, Gideon replied. The only difference would be getting paid by the government to do what I do anyway. Their lunch was interrupted by Gideon's phone ringing. The caller ID showed Admiral Crawford, now heading the Pentagon's Financial Crimes Division. Colonel, the Admiral said without preamble, we have a situation that requires your expertise. Can you be in Washington tomorrow morning? What kind of situation? The kind that involves missing children, international trafficking, and criminals who think they're untouchable because of their wealth and connections. Gideon's expression hardened. I'll be there. After ending the call, he looked at his children with the same expression they had seen 5 years earlier when they first uncovered Celeste's conspiracy. Duty calls? Finn asked. Something like that, Gideon replied. It seems there are more people in this world who need to learn that money and connections don't make you immune to consequences. Need any help with research or financial analysis? Finn offered. Always. But this time we do it officially, with proper government authorization and legal oversight. Much less fun than our amateur detective work, Finn observed with mock disappointment. But much more effective in the long run, Gideon replied. As they finished their meal and prepared to return to their respective responsibilities, Gideon reflected on how completely their family had been transformed by the crucible of betrayal and justice. Finn had evolved from a teenager uncovering his mother's affair to a professional financial investigator dedicated to protecting charitable organizations from fraud. Ivy had grown from a naive young woman to a successful architect who used her skills to build facilities that served vulnerable populations. Both of his children had learned to channel their intelligence and determination toward protecting innocent people rather than pursuing personal advantage. They had become exactly the kind of people the world needed more of, individuals with the skills and moral clarity to stand against those who exploited others. That evening, as Gideon prepared for his trip to Washington, he received an unexpected piece of mail. It was a letter from Celeste, the first communication he had received from her since her conviction. The letter was brief and predictable. She blamed him for destroying her life, claimed that she had been driven to crime by his emotional coldness, and suggested that a real man would have found a way to forgive her mistakes and rebuild their marriage. Gideon read the letter once, then fed it into his paper shredder without a second thought. Celeste still didn't understand that her crimes weren't mistakes. They were choices that revealed her fundamental character. She would spend the rest of her life in prison, convinced that she was a victim of circumstances beyond her control. She would never accept responsibility for the suffering she had caused or acknowledge the justice of her punishment. That was fine with Gideon. His concern was not with reforming criminals, but with protecting their potential victims. The next morning, as he boarded a flight to Washington, Gideon carried with him the knowledge that his family had not only survived betrayal, but had emerged stronger and more purposeful than before. Finn was building a career dedicated to financial justice. Ivy was using her talents to create healing spaces for people in crisis. And Gideon himself was about to begin a new phase of his life's work, hunting down international criminals who believed their wealth and connections made them untouchable. It was, he reflected, exactly the kind of legacy he wanted to leave his children. The knowledge that some people in the world would always stand against those who preyed on the innocent, regardless of the cost or complexity of the fight. As his plane lifted off, Gideon smiled with the cold satisfaction of a predator who had found his perfect prey. There were more Celestes and Brocks in the world, criminals who used their positions of trust to exploit vulnerable people. But now, there were also more people like the Hale family, individuals who had learned that true strength came not from the ability to forgive, but from the wisdom to know when forgiveness would enable further harm. The war against betrayal was never-ending, but Gideon and his children were prepared to fight it for as long as necessary. They had learned the most important lesson of all, that family loyalty meant protecting the innocent, not enabling the guilty. And they would never forget it. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Hello, and welcome to Infidelity Tales Lab. Your support means everything to us. We'd love to know, which geographical location are you joining from today? At home? On the go? Share with us below. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. Cracks in the Foundation. Leroy Fulton stood at the kitchen counter, nursing his third cup of coffee. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of the suburban home he'd worked 14 years to afford. Through the glass, he could see the perfectly manicured lawn, the tire swing he'd hung for Cody, and the garden beds where Melissa helped her mother plant tulips every spring. The house was quiet now. Vanessa had taken the kids to school, leaving behind only the scent of her expensive perfume and the remains of a tense breakfast. Their marriage of 12 years had been cooling for months, but lately, it felt like living with a stranger. Another late night at the office? She'd asked last night, her voice carrying an edge he couldn't quite place. The Hendrickson project isn't going to finish itself, Leroy had replied, loosening his tie. As a senior architectural engineer, his expertise came with demanding hours. You know how it is, Van. She'd only nodded, her attention fixed on her phone. The kids missed you at dinner. Again. It wasn't an accusation, not exactly, but it stung all the same. Leroy had been working overtime for months to ensure the promotion that would secure their financial future. The irony wasn't lost on him that his efforts to provide for his family kept him away from them. Now, standing in his empty kitchen, Leroy scrolled through the photos on his phone. Cody's last baseball game, Melissa's dance recital, family vacations to the lake house. What had the distance between him and Vanessa become so vast. When Hatter's smile toward him started looking forced. His phone buzzed with a text from his colleague, Dwayne. Meeting pushed to 11. Boss wants to discuss your promotion. Leroy smiled. At least something was going right. The promotion would mean better hours, more flexibility, and finally, the chance to be present for his family. As he drove to work, Leroy reflected on the changes he'd noticed in Vanessa. Her sudden interest in fitness, new wardrobe, and hours spent at the neighborhood book club. She'd been distant, distracted. He'd attributed it to her frustration with his work schedule, but something nagged at him. Something wasn't right. You're overthinking, he muttered to himself as he pulled into the parking garage. Fix the promotion, fix the hours, fix the marriage. At the office, Dwayne met him with a firm handshake. Today's the day, man. Regional Director Fulton has a nice ring to it. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Leroy said, but he couldn't help smiling. This promotion meant everything. The meeting went perfectly. By noon, Leroy was officially the new Regional Director of Engineering. He immediately called Vanessa to share the news. That's wonderful, she said, her voice oddly flat. We should talk when you get home tonight. The ominous tone made his stomach drop. Everything okay? We'll talk tonight, she repeated before hanging up. Throughout the afternoon, as colleagues congratulated him, Leroy's mind kept wandering to Vanessa's response. He left work early, stopping to pick up champagne and flowers. Whatever was wrong, they would fix it. With his new position, he could finally be the husband and father they deserved. When he arrived home, Vanessa was waiting in the living room, hands clasped in her lap. The children were nowhere to be seen. Where are the kids? Leroy asked, setting down his gifts. At my sister's. Vanessa's face was composed, but her eyes were red-rimmed. We need to talk, Leroy. He sat across from her, the champagne forgotten. What's going on? I've been thinking about this for a long time, she began, her voice steady. We've been growing apart. You're always working, and the kids, they need stability. Leroy leaned forward. That's why I've been working so hard for this promotion. Things will be different now. Better hours, more time with you and the kids. It's too late for that, Vanessa interrupted. We need space. I think you should move out for a while. Temporarily. The words hit him like a physical blow. Move out? Van, whatever problems we're having, we can work through them together. I just got promoted. The kids need stability, Vanessa said, her voice rising. They need routine and consistency. You're coming and going at all hours. The tension between us, it's affecting them. I'm asking you to move out temporarily, just until we figure things out. Leroy stared at his wife, searching for the woman he'd married 12 years ago. He thought about Cody and Melissa, how his absence had affected them. Maybe she was right. Maybe some space would help them all. How long is temporarily? He asked quietly. A few weeks. A month at most, she replied, looking relieved. We'll go to counseling, figure out what's best for the kids. Against his better judgment, Leroy agreed. For the kids. He would do anything for them. That night, he packed a suitcase and checked into the residence in Nir's office. As he sat on the edge of the hotel bed, staring at the generic landscape painting on the wall, Leroy couldn't shake the feeling that something else was going on. Something Vanessa wasn't telling him. Chapter 2. The Revelation. A week passed with minimal contact from Vanessa. Leroy called the kids daily, visited twice for awkward dinners where Vanessa remained distant, and threw himself into his new position at work. The separation was supposed to give them clarity, but Leroy felt only a growing unease. Have you considered that there might be someone else? Dwayne asked over lunch at their usual spot near the office. Leroy set down his sandwich. Vanessa wouldn't do that. Dwayne raised an eyebrow. New clothes, sudden interest in fitness, mysterious book club meetings, asking you to move out temporarily. Come on, man. We've been together since college, Leroy protested, but doubt had taken root. She wouldn't throw that away. For your sake, I hope you're right, Dwayne said. But maybe do a drive-by, just to ease your mind. The suggestion lingered as Leroy returned to work. That evening, instead of going back to his hotel room, he found himself driving through his neighborhood, toward the home he'd been asked to leave. As he approached, he slowed down. The evening was warm, and several neighbors were out in their yards. His neighbor, Boyd Hughes, was mowing the lawn. Boyd had moved in next door about a year ago after his divorce. He was a physical therapist who worked at the local medical center. Friendly enough, though Leroy had always found something off-putting about him. Leroy was about to drive past when the front door of his house opened. Vanessa emerged carrying a glass of what looked like lemonade. She crossed the lawn to where Boyd was finishing up with the mower. Leroy watched, his hands tightening on the steering wheel as she handed Boyd the drink. He could justify that. A neighborly gesture, nothing more. What he couldn't justify was what happened next. Vanessa leaned in and kissed Boyd, not a friendly peck, but the kind of kiss reserved for lovers. Boyd's arm snaked around her waist, pulling her close. Leroy felt physically ill. He pulled over, unable to drive, his vision blurring with anger and betrayal. As he sat there, trying to process what he'd seen, the front door opened again. Cody and Melissa ran out, racing toward Boyd with obvious excitement. "Daddy," they shouted in unison, throwing themselves at him. Boyd caught them, laughing, swinging Melissa up while ruffling Cody's hair. The tableau was perfectly domestic, a happy family enjoying the evening together. Except it was Boyd in Leroy's place, with Leroy's wife and Leroy's children. The shot gave way to a cold rage unlike anything Leroy had ever experienced. Everything clicked into place. The distance, the book club meetings, Vanessa's insistence that he move out. It hadn't been about space or stability for the kids. It had been about clearing the way for Boyd to take his place. Leroy started the car and drove away before they noticed him. He needed time to think, to plan, because one thing was certain, this betrayal would not stand. That night, he called a real estate agent and instructed her to list the house for sale immediately. The property was in his name. His inheritance had paid for the down payment. Legally, he had every right to sell it. "Are you sure about this, Mr. Fulton?" the agent asked. Typically, in a marital separation, "I'm sure," Leroy said, his voice calm despite the storm inside him. "I want the for sale sign up tomorrow." Next, he called Omar Hendricks, the best divorce attorney in the city. He explained the situation, including the affair and his children calling another man daddy. "Document everything," Omar advised, "and don't confront them yet. We need to build our case first." Leroy hung up, his mind racing with questions. How long had this been going on? Did everyone know except him? How could Vanessa and Boyd have manipulated his children into calling another man daddy in just 1 week? The answers would come. For now, Leroy focused on one thing. They would pay for this betrayal. All of them. Chapter 3. The Declaration of War. The for sale sign went up the next day, just as Leroy had instructed. He parked down the street, watching from a distance as the real estate agent hammered it into the front lawn. Within an hour, his phone exploded with texts and calls from Vanessa. He ignored them all, savoring her panic. Finally, he answered. "What the hell are you doing?" Vanessa demanded, her voice shrill. "You can't sell our house." "Actually, I can," Leroy replied calmly. "The deed is in my name. My inheritance, my house. The children." "Don't you dare talk to me about the children." Leroy cut her off, his voice dangerously quiet. "I saw them yesterday, Vanessa. I saw them call Boy Daddy." A beat of silence followed. "Leroy, I can explain." "Save it for the divorce proceedings," he said. "I've already retained an attorney. Expect to be served tomorrow." "Please, let's talk about this like adults," Vanessa pleaded, her tone shifting to conciliatory. "For the sake of the kids who call another man daddy." Leroy laughed bitterly. "Tell me, how long has this been going on? Weeks? Months?" "The entire time I was working overtime for that promotion to give you and the kids a better life." Another pause. "It's complicated." "It's really not," Leroy said. "You betrayed me. You betrayed our family. And you turned my children against me. That's not fair." "The kids are confused. They seem pretty clear on who their daddy is now," Leroy retorted. "I wonder what the judge will think about that." "You're being irrational," Vanessa said, desperation creeping into her voice. "Please just come home. We can work this out." "I'm being perfectly rational," Leroy replied. "And that house isn't my home anymore. Not with you and Boyd playing house there." "What do you want?" Vanessa asked finally. Leroy's voice hardened. "I want you to understand exactly what you've done. I want you and Boyd to feel what it's like to have everything taken away. And I'm just getting started. He hung up, a grim satisfaction replacing the hollow ache in his chest. The betrayal still hurt. It would probably always hurt, but now he had purpose. They thought they could steal his life, his family. They were about to learn how wrong they were. That evening, Leroy met with Omar to formalize their strategy. The attorney listened as Leroy laid out everything he knew about the affair. "We'll file for divorce on grounds of adultery," Omar said, making notes. "And we'll push for full custody." Full custody? Leroy hadn't considered that. "They call him Daddy now, which actually works in our favor," Omar explained. "It shows parental alienation. They've encouraged the children to replace you. That's considered emotional abuse in family court." The thought of taking the children from Vanessa gave Leroy pause. Despite everything, they were still his kids. But then he remembered their excited voices calling out to Boyd, and his resolve hardened. "Do it," he said. "I want everything, the house, the kids, child support from her." Omar nodded. "We'll need evidence of the affair. Text messages, emails, witness statements, anything you can get." "Leave that to me," Leroy said. Over the next few days, Leroy orchestrated his first moves. He froze the joint bank accounts, transferred his direct deposit to a new account, and hired a private investigator to document the affair. He also reached out to parents of his children's friends and teachers at their school, establishing that he had always been an involved father despite his work schedule. When Vanessa was served with divorce papers, she showed up at his hotel, tears streaming down her face. "You don't have to do this," she begged. "We can still fix things." Leroy regarded her coolly. "There's nothing to fix. You made your choice. The kids are devastated about the house," she said. "They don't understand why you're doing this." "I'm sure Boyd can console them," Leroy replied. "Since he's daddy now." Vanessa flinched. That was a mistake. They were confused. "Save the lies for someone who still believes them." Leroy cut her off. "You made your bed with Boyd. Now you both get to lie in it." As Vanessa left, Leroy felt a moment of doubt. Was he going too far? Then he remembered the kiss, the children's excited voices calling another man daddy, and the weeks, maybe months, of deception. No, he wasn't going too far. In fact, he was just getting started. The house sale and divorce were only the opening moves. The real revenge was still to come. Because Leroy Fulton never forgot a betrayal. And he never, ever forgave one. Chapter 4. Gathering Intelligence. 2 weeks after filing for divorce, Leroy moved into a sleek downtown apartment. The space was modern and impersonal, the opposite of the warm family home he'd lost, but it suited his current state of mind. He'd arranged his home office to function as a war room, with a whiteboard mapping out his revenge strategy. "You sure you want to go this route?" Dwayne asked, eyeing the detailed plans on the board. "Divorce is one thing, but this is scorched earth." "They scorched the earth first," Leroy replied, uncapping a marker to add another note. "I'm just making sure they reap what they've sown." The private investigator, Marla Winters, had delivered her first report, and it was even worse than Leroy had imagined. Boyd and Vanessa's affair had been going on for 8 months, nearly the entire time Boyd had lived next door. They'd met at the gym, where Boyd worked part-time as a personal trainer, and their workout sessions had quickly moved to his house when Leroy was at work. Even more disturbing, text messages recovered from the family cloud account showed that Vanessa had been deliberately alienating the children from Leroy, telling them that Daddy is too busy for us and that Boyd cares about us more. She'd been laying the groundwork for replacing him long before asking him to move out. "Your wife's been planning this exit for months," Marla had explained. The temporary separation was just to test the waters, see how the kids adjusted to Boyd before making it permanent. The revelation had crystallized Leroy's resolve. This wasn't just an affair born of opportunity or neglect. This was calculated, premeditated betrayal. Now, Leroy studied the information he'd gathered. Boyd Hughes had his own skeletons, a messy divorce, gambling debts at a local casino, and a history of dating married women. His physical therapy practice was struggling financially, which explained his interest in Vanessa, whose family had money. Vanessa's vulnerabilities were equally clear. Her social standing in the community mattered enormously to her, as did her image as a perfect mother. She'd been secretly funneling money from their joint account to Boyd for months, ostensibly for training sessions, but actually helping him cover his gambling losses. The custody hearing is next week, Dwayne reminded him. You ready for that? Leroy nodded grimly. More than ready. That evening, Leroy met with Omar to review their custody strategy. The attorney seemed impressed by the evidence Leroy had gathered. Parental alienation, financial infidelity, exposing the children to her affair partner. The judge won't look kindly on any of this, Omar said. But be prepared. She'll come at you hard about your work hours. I've addressed that, Leroy said. My new position allows flexible hours and remote work. I've already arranged a modified schedule to accommodate school pickups and activities. Omar nodded approvingly. Good. And what about this? He tapped a folder labeled Phase 2. That's personal, Leroy said. Nothing illegal, but not relevant to the custody case. Omar gave him a knowing look. Just be careful. Revenge may feel good in the moment, but it can backfire. Leroy's expression hardened. This isn't about feeling good. It's about justice. Later that night, Leroy received a text from an unknown number. It was Boyd. We need to talk. Man to man. Leroy considered ignoring it, but then saw an opportunity. Your place. Tomorrow. 8 p.m. The response came immediately. Thank you. Leroy smiled grimly. Boyd had no idea what was coming. The next evening, Leroy arrived at Boyd's house precisely at 8. The neighbor's house was smaller than his own, a bachelor pad with minimal furnishings and a prominent large-screen TV. Boyd opened the door, looking uncomfortable. Thanks for coming. Can I get you a drink? Let's skip the pleasantries, Leroy said, remaining standing. What do you want? Boyd sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. Look, I know you're upset. Upset, Leroy repeated with a hollow laugh. Is that what you think this is? I know it's more than that. Boyd backpedaled. But this situation has gotten out of control. The kids are suffering. Don't you dare talk about my children. Leroy cut him off, his voice deadly quiet. You don't have the right. Boyd held up his hands. I care about them too. That's why I wanted to talk. This war you're waging, selling the house, freezing accounts, the custody battle, it's hurting everyone. Again, why should I care? You and Vanessa didn't care about hurting me when you started sleeping together. You didn't care about hurting the kids when you encouraged them to call you daddy. Boyd had the grace to look ashamed. That was wrong. I admit that. But it only happened a couple of times, and Vanessa corrected them. After 8 months of sneaking around, Leroy challenged. After deliberately turning them against me, after asking me to move out so you could move in, save your lies for someone stupid enough to believe them. Boyd's expression changed, growing harder. What do you want, Leroy? Money? I'll pay you back for the training sessions. Leroy laughed. You think this is about money? This is about the fact that you and Vanessa tried to steal my life. My home. My children. Nobody stole anything, Boyd protested. Marriages end. People move on. They do, Leroy agreed, his voice softening dangerously. And actions have consequences. Something in Leroy's tone made Boyd pale. Are you threatening me? Not at all, Leroy replied with a cold smile. I'm just letting you know that I'm fully aware of everything. The gambling debts, the pattern of targeting married women, the money Vanessa's been funneling to you. All of it. Boyd's face went from pale to ashen. How did you? Doesn't matter, Leroy cut him off. What matters is that you and Vanessa made a critical mistake. You thought I was weak, that I'd roll over and accept your betrayal. He stepped closer. I'm going to take back everything that's mine, and then I'm going to make sure you both lose everything else. This is insane, Boyd stammered. You need help, man. Therapy or something. What I need, Leroy said evenly, is for you to understand exactly who you're dealing with. This isn't a negotiation. It's a courtesy call to let you know that your comfortable little plan is about to implode. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. Oh, and Boyd, the next time you try to play daddy with my kids, remember this conversation. As Leroy walked back to his car, he felt a cold satisfaction. The fear in Boyd's eyes had been real. Good. Let him worry. Let him wonder what was coming next. Because phase 2 of Leroy's plan was about to begin. Chapter 5. Laying the groundwork. The custody hearing arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. Leroy sat beside Omar in the sterile courtroom, watching as Vanessa entered with her attorney, Patricia Conway, a shark-like woman known for aggressive tactics in divorce cases. Vanessa looked exhausted, her designer outfit unable to hide the toll the past weeks had taken. Boyd was notably absent, a tactical decision, Leroy assumed, to distance himself from the proceedings. Judge Harriet Sandoval, a no-nonsense veteran of family court, reviewed the preliminary documents with a frown. Before we begin, I want to be clear that my only concern is the well-being of the minor children. I don't care about your personal grievances with each other. The hearing proceeded. Vanessa's attorney presented her as a devoted stay-at-home mother whose entire life revolved around the children. She painted Leroy as a workaholic who had emotionally abandoned his family. Mrs. Fulton has been the primary caregiver since the children were born, Conway argued. Mr. Fulton regularly worked 60-hour weeks, missing school events and family dinners. The children have stability with their mother. When it was Omar's turn, he approached the matter differently. Your Honor, we agree that Mrs. Fulton has been physically present. What we contest is the quality of her care and the deliberate campaign to alienate the children from their father. He presented the evidence, text messages where Vanessa told the children that Daddy doesn't want to be with us anymore, records showing that she had scheduled important school events during Leroy's planned visitation times, and testimony from Melissa's teacher that Vanessa had instructed the school to remove Leroy from the emergency contact list weeks before the separation. Then came the bombshell, photos from the private investigator showing Boyd and Vanessa together, dating back 8 months, along with bank records of the money transfers. Mrs. Fulton has been conducting an affair with a neighbor for 8 months, Omar stated. She has exposed the children to this relationship, encouraged them to call this man daddy, and used family funds to support his gambling addiction. Vanessa gasped, her composure cracking. That's not true. Boyd doesn't have a gambling problem. Judge Sandoval's gaze sharpened. Mrs. Fulton, you will speak only when addressed by the court. Conway tried to recover, arguing that Leroy's evidence was obtained unethically, but the damage was done. The judge had seen the bank records, the texts, the timeline of deception. When Leroy took the stand, he spoke with calm sincerity about his love for his children and his new work arrangements that would allow him to be present for them. I worked those long hours to provide for my family, he explained. The promotion I recently received was the goal I'd been working toward. Better pay, better hours, the ability to be more present. I never imagined my wife was using my absence to replace me in my children's lives. By the end of the hearing, Judge Sandoval looked troubled. I'll render my decision within the week, she announced. In the meantime, the current visitation schedule will remain in effect. Outside the courtroom, Conway approached Omar and Leroy with a proposal. My client is willing to discuss a more equitable custody arrangement and property division if Mr. Fulton will reconsider selling the house. Leroy met Vanessa's pleading gaze across the hallway. Tell your client that ship has sailed, he replied. We'll wait for the judge's ruling. Later that day, Leroy received an unexpected visitor at his apartment. Trish Winters, Vanessa's best friend since college. He almost didn't answer when the concierge called up, but curiosity won out. Trish looked uncomfortable standing in his minimalist living room. I probably shouldn't be here, she began, declining his offer of a drink. But I thought you should know some things. About Vanessa and Boyd? Leroy asked, gesturing for her to sit. Trish nodded, perching on the edge of the sofa. It's worse than you think. Boyd approached Vanessa, not the other way around. He had this whole system. Find unhappy wives at the gym, become their trainer, their confidant, then their lover. Leroy's jaw tightened. And you knew about this? Not at first, Trish admitted. Vanessa only told me they were having problems with you. By the time I realized what was really happening, they were already... She trailed off. Sleeping together, Leroy finished flatly. Trish nodded miserably. I told her to end it, to come clean with you. But Boyd had convinced her that you didn't really care about her or the kids anymore. And the children calling him daddy, that was his idea too, Trish said, looking genuinely disgusted. He told Vanessa it would help them adjust to the new family structure. I thought it was sick, but Vanessa was completely under his spell. Leroy processed this information, adding it to his mental file. Why are you telling me this now? Trish sighed. Because after the hearing today, I saw who Boyd really is. When the judge seemed to be leaning your way, he told Vanessa that maybe they should cut their losses, meaning her and the kids. He's already seeing someone else, Leroy, some divorcee from his gym with a hefty settlement. The revelation should have brought satisfaction, but Leroy only felt a deep, cold anger. Not just at Boyd now, but at Vanessa for being so easily manipulated for putting their children in this position. Does Vanessa know you're here? He asked. Trish shook her head. She wouldn't listen anyway. Boyd has convinced her that you're the villain, that you're being cruel and vindictive. I am being vindictive, Leroy acknowledged, but only because they tried to take everything from me. After Trish left, Leroy updated his revenge board with the new information. Boyd's pattern of targeting vulnerable married women, his quick pivot to a new prospect when things got difficult. These were weaknesses Leroy could exploit. Phase 2 would require precision timing. The custody decision, the house sale, and his next moves all needed to align perfectly. Leroy picked up his phone and made a call to Marla, the PI. I need everything you can get on Boyd's new target, he instructed. And I mean everything. The woman's voice was clipped, professional. I'd advise against direct confrontation or harassment, Mr. Fulton. Nothing like that, Leroy assured her. Just information. Knowledge is power, after all. 3 days later, Judge Sandoval issued her custody ruling. Joint legal custody with Leroy as the primary physical custodian. Vanessa would have the children on weekends and Wednesday evenings. The ruling cited concerns about Vanessa's judgment in involving the children in her relationship with Boyd and the documented attempts at parental alienation. Vanessa called immediately, sobbing. How could you do this? Take my children from me. I didn't, Leroy replied calmly. Your actions did. You chose Boyd over your family. I made a mistake, she cried. I know that now. Boyd isn't who I thought he was. Let me guess, he's already moved on to his next target? Leroy couldn't keep the bitter satisfaction from his voice. Vanessa's silence was answer enough. The house closes next week, Leroy continued. You have until Friday to remove your belongings. Where are we supposed to go? Vanessa asked, desperation evident in her voice. That's not my problem anymore, Leroy said. Maybe Boyd will take you in. Oh wait, he's busy with his new girlfriend. As he hung up, Leroy felt no joy in Vanessa's distress. Only the grim determination to complete what he'd started. Boyd had moved on to his next victim, leaving Vanessa to face the consequences alone. But Leroy wasn't finished with either of them. The next phase would ensure that Boyd could never do to another family what he'd done to Leroy's. And Vanessa would understand exactly what her betrayal had cost. The foundations were laid. Now it was time to build the trap that would destroy them both. Chapter 6. The trap is set. The closing on the house went smoothly. Leroy used his portion of the proceeds to purchase a comfortable 3-bedroom home in a good school district, ensuring the children would have stability. The rest he set aside in a trust for Cody and Melissa's education, accessible only when they turned 18. Vanessa had moved in with her sister temporarily, her relationship with Boyd effectively over. According to Trish, who had become an unexpected ally, Boyd had completely ghosted Vanessa once the custody ruling came down, moving on to his new target, Renee Simmons, a recently divorced pharmaceutical sales rep with a substantial settlement. She's devastated, Trish reported during one of their coffee meetings. Not just about Boyd, but about losing primary custody. She finally sees how she was manipulated, but it's too late. Leroy felt a flicker of pity, quickly extinguished by the memory of his children calling another man daddy. She made her choices, he said simply. The first weekend the children came to stay at his new house was tense. Cody, at 10, was old enough to understand some of what had happened and regarded Leroy with wary resentment. 8-year-old Melissa was confused and tearful, asking repeatedly when they could go home. This is your home now, Leroy explained patiently, showing them their rooms, decorated according to their preferences. At least part of the time, you'll still see Mom on weekends. And Boyd, Cody asked, a challenge in his young voice. Leroy crouched to his son's level. Boyd won't be around anymore. He and your mom aren't together now. Melissa's face crumpled, but he said he was going to be our new daddy. The pain was sharp, but Leroy kept his expression gentle. I know things have been confusing, but I'm your dad. I've always been your dad, and I always will be. No one can change that. Over dinner, he avoided discussing Vanessa or the divorce, instead focusing on their interests and school activities. Slowly, the tension eased. By bedtime, Melissa had curled up beside him on the couch, and Cody had begrudgingly shown him his latest video game progress. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Rebuilding his relationship with his children would take time, but Leroy was committed to the process. They were innocent victims in this mess, manipulated by the adults they trusted. The following week, Leroy implemented the next phase of his plan. With Marla's help, he compiled a comprehensive dossier on Boyd's predatory pattern. The married women he'd targeted at the gym, the financial support he'd extracted from them, and his swift abandonment when things got complicated. He arranged a meeting with the owner of the health club where Boyd worked as a trainer. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Leroy assured the nervous manager, Carlton Mills. "I just think you should be aware of what's happening on your premises." He presented the evidence, statements from 3 women Boyd had pursued, bank records showing the money Vanessa had given him, and documentation of his gambling debts. "He's using your facility to target vulnerable women," Leroy explained. "Specifically, married women with access to financial resources. Once he bleeds them dry or things get complicated, he moves on to the next target." Carlton reviewed the material with growing alarm. "I had no idea. We've had a few complaints about him being too friendly with female clients, but nothing like this." "His latest target is Renee Simmons," Leroy added. "She trains with him Tuesday and Thursday mornings." "I'll address this immediately," Carlton promised. "This behavior violates every ethical standard we have." Boyd was fired the next day. According to Trish, who heard it from Vanessa, he was escorted out mid-session, his belongings from the employee locker room delivered to him in the parking lot. The timing aligned perfectly with Leroy's next move. Through Omar, he had quietly contacted the casino where Boyd had accumulated his gambling debts. The manager was very interested to learn about Boyd's sudden unemployment and his pattern of extracting money from vulnerable women. "We take problem gambling very seriously," the casino manager assured Omar. "We'll ensure Mr. Hughes is added to our exclusion list. And of course, we'll be pursuing collection of his outstanding debts." With Boyd's primary income gone and his access to the casino revoked, Leroy knew his financial situation would quickly become desperate. The gambling debts weren't huge, about $30,000. But without income and with his reputation in the physical therapy community now tarnished, Boyd would struggle to make payments. The next part required careful timing. Leroy had learned from Marla that Boyd had been falsifying some of his physical therapy credentials. He hadn't completed the continuing education requirements for his license renewal, but had submitted documentation claiming he had. An anonymous tip to the state licensing board would ensure that Boyd's private practice, already struggling, would come under scrutiny. But Leroy held that card for now, waiting for the right moment. Meanwhile, he focused on rebuilding his life with his children. The transition was challenging, but each week brought improvement. Cody gradually dropped his defensive attitude, and Melissa stopped asking about Boyd. They established new routines, new traditions. Vanessa, however, was struggling. Without Boyd or her children full-time, she seemed lost. Her sister was pressuring her to find her own place, but with no income of her own and the divorce settlement still pending, her options were limited. "She's talking about moving back to her parents' place in Phoenix," Trish reported. "She can't afford to stay here, especially with child support payments." The news gave Leroy pause. If Vanessa moved out of state, it would complicate the custody arrangement and potentially hurt the children. "Tell her I'll meet with her," he said finally. "Just her. No lawyers." They met at a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown. Vanessa looked thinner, her designer clothes replaced by jeans and a simple blouse. The confident, polished woman he'd married was gone, replaced by someone who seemed perpetually on the verge of tears. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, her voice subdued. "I wasn't sure you would." Leroy nodded curtly. "Trish mentioned you're considering moving to Phoenix." "I don't have much choice," Vanessa replied. "I can't afford to stay here." My parents offered me their guest house until I can get back on my feet. And the kids. Vanessa looked down at her coffee. I was hoping we could revise the custody arrangement. Summer with me, school year with you, or longer visits during school breaks. Leroy considered his next words carefully. Despite everything, he didn't want to punish his children by depriving them of their mother. But he also wasn't willing to disrupt the stability they were finally establishing. I'll have Omar draw up an amendment to the custody agreement, he said finally. You keep your weekends when you're in town, plus extended time during school breaks. But the children stay with me during the school year. Relief flooded Vanessa's face. Thank you. That's more than fair given. She trailed off. Given that you try to replace me with Boyd? Leroy finished, his voice cooler now. Given that you taught our children to call another man daddy? Yes, it is more than fair. Vanessa flinched. I've apologized for that. I was wrong. Terrible, unforgivably wrong. Boyd manipulated me, but I let him. I betrayed you and the kids, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. Save the apologies. Leroy cut her off. They don't change anything. What more do you want from me? Vanessa asked, desperation edging into her voice. You've taken the house, the kids, my reputation in the community. I'm moving halfway across the country. Isn't that enough? Leroy regarded her dispassionately. You chose Boyd over our family. You lied, cheated, manipulated our children. And when it all fell apart, you expected sympathy. He leaned forward. Let me be perfectly clear. I will never forgive what you did. Ever. The only reason I'm being civil is for Cody and Melissa's sake. Tears spilled down Vanessa's cheeks. I know. I don't deserve forgiveness. But please don't punish the kids because of my mistakes. I'm not punishing anyone, Leroy replied. I'm protecting what's mine. He stood, leaving his coffee untouched. Omar will contact your attorney about the amended custody agreement. As he walked away, Leroy felt a familiar cold satisfaction. Vanessa was broken, her perfect life in shambles. Boyd was unemployed, blacklisted, and facing financial ruin. Everything was proceeding according to plan. But there was still one final phase to execute. The piece of the puzzle that would ensure neither of them could ever recover from their betrayal. It was time to spring the trap. Chapter 7. The First Domino Falls. 3 months after Vanessa moved to Phoenix, Leroy received an unexpected call from Renee Simmons, Boyd's latest target. He had been monitoring the situation through Marla, but hadn't anticipated direct contact. Mr. Fulton? You don't know me, but I think we have a mutual problem, Renee began, her voice tense. Boyd Hughes. Leroy's interest was immediately piqued. What can I do for you, Miss Simmons? I understand you were married to Vanessa Fulton, and that Boyd was involved with her. That's correct, Leroy confirmed, careful to keep his tone neutral. Though we're divorced now, I've recently discovered some disturbing information about Boyd, Renee continued. He's been, let's just say I'm not the only woman he's been seeing. And there are financial irregularities I can't ignore. I'm familiar with his methods, Leroy said. I've ended things with him, but now he's becoming threatening, Renee explained. Calling at all hours, showing up at my workplace. He seems desperate. This was an unexpected development, Boyd turning aggressive when his usual tactics failed. Leroy considered the implications. Have you contacted the police? I filed a report, but they said they can't do much without evidence of an actual threat. Renee sounded frustrated. Your ex-wife's friend Trish suggested I call you. She said you might have information that could help. Leroy smiled slightly. Trish had become an unexpected ally in all this. I may, yes. Would you be willing to meet? They arranged to meet at a downtown restaurant the following evening. Renee was an attractive woman in her early 40s, poised and professional in her pharmaceutical sales role. She brought a folder of her own documentation. He convinced me to invest in his private physical therapy practice, she explained, showing Leroy the paperwork. $50,000, supposedly secured against the business assets. Then I discovered he's not even licensed properly. Leroy nodded. His continuing education credits were falsified. The state board is already investigating. Renee looked surprised. How do you know that? I've been tracking Boyd's activities for some time, Leroy admitted. After what he did to my family, I wanted to ensure he couldn't do it to anyone else. Understanding dawned in Renee's eyes. The anonymous complaint to the licensing board. The casino ban. The gym firing. That was all you. Leroy neither confirmed nor denied, simply giving her a measured look. Boyd has a pattern of targeting vulnerable women, extracting money, then moving on. He nearly destroyed my family. I'm merely ensuring there are consequences. I'm not usually vindictive, Renee said slowly. But he's taken money I can't afford to lose, money from my divorce settlement meant for my daughter's college fund. And now these threats. She pushed her phone across the table, showing a series of increasingly desperate and angry texts for Boyd. Leroy reviewed them carefully. The progression was clear. Initial pleas, then manipulation, finally thinly veiled threats about making her regret cutting him off. This is actionable, Leroy noted, especially combined with showing up at your workplace. You need a restraining order. The police said there weren't specific enough threats, Renee repeated. The police don't always get it right, Leroy replied. I know someone who can help. A specialist in protective orders for women dealing with harassment. He took out his phone and called Omar, explaining the situation briefly. After the call, he turned back to Renee. Omar's associate can see you tomorrow morning. She has an excellent success rate with these cases. Thank you, Renee said, genuine gratitude in her voice. But what about my investment? Boyd's already spent most of it, for what I can tell. That's where I may be able to help, Leroy said. I've been building a case against Boyd for some time. With your documentation added to what I already have, we can file a civil suit for fraud. He won't be able to pay immediately, but we can secure a judgment against any future earnings. Renee studied him thoughtfully. This isn't just about helping me, is it? This is part of your plan. Leroy smiled slightly. Let's just say our interests align. You want your money back and protection from Boyd. I want to ensure he faces consequences for his actions. Does my motivation matter if the outcome benefits us both? I suppose not, Renee conceded. What's the next step? Over the next 2 weeks, Leroy's plan accelerated. With Renee's documentation added to his own evidence, Omar filed a comprehensive civil suit against Boyd for fraud, misrepresentation, and harassment. The restraining order was granted, prohibiting Boyd from coming within 500 feet of Renee or contacting her in any way. Boyd's response was predictable: panic. He called Leroy repeatedly, finally catching him on a Sunday afternoon. You're behind this, aren't you? Boyd demanded, his voice slurring slightly. The license investigation, the casino ban, and now this lawsuit with Renee. I have no idea what you're talking about, Leroy replied calmly. Bullshit, Boyd spat. You've been systematically destroying my life for months. This has to stop. Leroy's voice hardened. Like you stopped when you pursued my wife. When you convinced my children to call you daddy. When you tried to take over my family. That was different, Boyd protested. Vanessa was unhappy. I didn't force her into anything. You targeted a vulnerable woman, manipulated her against her husband, used her for money, and then discarded her when things got difficult, Leroy corrected him. Just like you did with Renee and who knows how many others. I'm ruined, Leroy. Boyd's voice cracked with genuine desperation. The license board is suspending me pending investigation. The casino is suing me for unpaid debts. I can't get hired anywhere because of the gym firing. And now this fraud case? I'll never recover. That sounds like a personal problem, Leroy replied coldly. Perhaps you should have considered the potential consequences before you decided to destroy my family. What do you want? Boyd asked, defeat evident in his voice. Money? I don't have any. An apology? Fine, I'm sorry. Just call off the dogs. I don't want anything from you, Leroy said. I've already taken back what's mine, my children, my dignity. You're merely experiencing the natural consequences of your actions. After hanging up, Leroy felt the familiar cold satisfaction. Boyd was spiraling exactly as planned. The first domino had fallen. The next target was Vanessa. While Boyd's destruction was professional and financial, Vanessa's would be more personal. Through Trish, Leroy had learned that Vanessa was struggling in Phoenix. Living in her parents' guest house had quickly become intolerable, with her mother's constant criticism and her father's thinly veiled disappointment. She'd found a job as an administrative assistant at a local medical practice, but the pay barely covered her child support payments and basic expenses. More importantly, She was desperate to rebuild her relationship with the children. The distance made it difficult, despite Leroy's adherence to the amended custody agreement, allowing extended visits during school breaks. It was this desperation that Leroy intended to leverage. When the children returned from their spring break visit to Phoenix, Cody was unusually quiet. After Melissa went to bed, Leroy found his son sitting alone in the backyard, staring at the night sky. "Everything okay, buddy?" Leroy asked, settling into the chair beside him. Cody shrugged. Mom's boyfriend was weird. Leroy's attention sharpened. "Boyfriend? Your mom is dating someone." "Some guy from her work?" Cody explained. "He stayed over a couple of nights. He kept trying to be all buddy-buddy with us, but it felt fake." The parallel to Boyd was unmistakable. Leroy kept his tone neutral. "Did that make you uncomfortable?" Cody nodded. "Mom kept saying we needed to give him a chance, that he could be part of our family someday. I told her we already have a dad." He glanced at Leroy. "That's what you always tell us, right? That no one can replace you as our dad." Leroy felt a surge of pride in his son's perception. "That's right. No one can ever change that. That's what I told Mom," Cody continued. "She got really upset, said I was being difficult on purpose." The information was perfect, exactly what Leroy needed. "Thank you for telling me, Cody. I'll talk to your mom about this." The next day, Leroy called Omar. "I need to modify the custody agreement again. Vanessa has a new boyfriend staying overnight during the children's visits. Cody says she's pressuring them to accept him as part of the family." Omar understood immediately. Given the history with Boyd, this could be considered a pattern of behavior harmful to the children's emotional well-being. "I'll file a motion for supervised visitation only." The motion was granted surprisingly quickly. Judge Sandoval remembered the previous case well and viewed this new development as a continuation of Vanessa's poor judgment regarding the children's relationships with male figures. Vanessa was devastated. She called Leroy, sobbing. "How could you do this? Mark is just a friend who stayed over because his apartment was being fumigated." "That's not what Cody says," Leroy replied calmly. "He says you told him Mark could be part of the family someday." "Sound familiar, Vanessa? Like Boyd all over again." "It's nothing like that," Vanessa protested. "I've learned my lesson. I would never repeat that mistake." "The judge disagrees," Leroy said. "Supervised visitation only until you demonstrate better judgment." "Please," Vanessa begged. "The children are all I have left. Don't take them from me." For a moment, Leroy almost felt pity. Then he remembered his children calling Boyd Daddy, and his resolve hardened. "You did this to yourself, Vanessa. Actions have consequences." The final domino was about to fall. Chapter 8. The Wheels of Justice. 6 months into Leroy's campaign of retribution, the results were undeniable. Boyd Hughes had filed for bankruptcy, unable to pay the mounting judgments against him from the casino, Renee's fraud case, and various creditors. His physical therapy license had been suspended pending the investigation into his falsified continuing education credits, effectively ending his career. According to Marla's latest report, Boyd had left the state, moving to Nevada to work as a barback at a small casino, a humiliating step down for a man who once styled himself as a sophisticated professional. Vanessa remained in Phoenix, struggling with the limitations of supervised visitation and the financial strain of child support payments. Her parents' initial sympathy had soured into resentment, creating a tense living situation. "She's talking about contesting the custody arrangement again," Trish reported during one of their regular updates. "She's saying she'll prove you manipulated Cody into saying those things about Mark." Leroy had anticipated this. "Let her try. Cody is old enough that the judge will interview him privately. He'll tell the truth." "Don't you think this has gone far enough?" Trish asked, looking troubled. "Vanessa's a mess. She cries all the time, barely eats. Her relationship with her parents is falling apart. She lost her job last week." "Why should I care?" Leroy asked coldly. Trish sighed. "Because you're not a monster, Leroy. What Vanessa and Boyd did was terrible, but this systematic destruction of their lives, it's changing you." Her words gave him pause. Had his pursuit of justice turned into something darker? He dismissed the thought. They had tried to steal everything from him, his family, his home, his identity as a father. They deserved everything that had happened to them. This isn't about revenge anymore, he told Trish. It's about protection. As long as Vanessa keeps trying to replace me with other men in my children's lives, I'll keep fighting her. But in the quiet moments, late at night when the children were asleep, Leroy sometimes questioned his own motivations. The cold satisfaction he felt at Boyd's downfall and Vanessa's struggles. Was that justice or something uglier? These reflections were interrupted by an unexpected development. Renee Simmons called with alarming news. "Boyd's back in town," she said without preamble. "And he's been asking about you." Leroy straightened in his chair. "What do you mean?" "One of the trainers in my new gym knows him from before," Renee explained. "Boyd approached him asking all sorts of questions about you. Your schedule, where you live, whether you're seeing anyone." It sounded concerning. "Did he violate the restraining order?" Leroy asked. "No, he's been careful about that," Renee replied. "But the way my trainer described it, Boyd seemed obsessed with you. Blamed you for everything that's happened to him." Leroy considered this information. Boyd had always struck him as a coward, more likely to run than confront. But desperation could change a man. "Thank you for letting me know," he said. "I'll take precautions." Those precautions included installing a security system at his home and informing his children's school about potential concerns. He also called Marla, requesting enhanced surveillance on Boyd's movements. 2 days later, Marla confirmed Renee's warning. "Hughes is staying at the Motel 6 on Route 30, she reported. "He's been drinking heavily and making threatening statements about you to anyone who'll listen." "Has he attempted contact?" Leroy asked. "Not yet," Marla replied. "But he's been driving past your house and the children's school. I've documented everything in case you need to file for a protective order." Leroy considered his options. A protective order might provoke Boyd rather than deter him. Better to let the man believe he was undetected for now, while monitoring his movements. The confrontation, when it came, was not what Leroy expected. He was working late at his office when the security desk called up. "Mr. Fulton, there's a gentleman here insisting on seeing you. A Mr. Hughes. He seems agitated." Leroy's pulse quickened. "I'll come down." In the lobby, Boyd looked like a shadow of his former self. Gone was the polished personal trainer with the perfect hair and confident smile. This Boyd was gaunt, with several days' stubble and bloodshot eyes. He reeked of alcohol. "You finally got the guts to face me." Boyd slurred when he saw Leroy. "Been avoiding me for days." Leroy remained calm. "I've been aware of your presence, Boyd. The smart move would have been to stay in Nevada." Boyd's face contorted with anger. "You ruined my life. Everything I built. Gone because of you." "You built nothing," Leroy corrected him. "You preyed on vulnerable women, stole their money, and moved on when things got complicated. I merely exposed what you already were. You had no right." Boyd took a step forward, drawing the attention of the security guard. "Vanessa wanted me. The kids like me better than you. You couldn't accept that, so you destroyed everything." Leroy's voice turned glacial. "You entered my home, slept with my wife, and encouraged my children to call you daddy. You have the audacity to stand there and claim I had no right to protect what's mine." Boyd's hand moved to his pocket, and Leroy tensed, but the security guard was faster, stepping between them. "Sir, I need you to leave now," the guard told Boyd firmly, "before I call the police." Boyd hesitated, then sneered at Leroy. "This isn't over." "Actually, it is," Leroy replied. "You're finished, Boyd. You have nothing left to threaten me with." After Boyd was escorted out, Leroy called Omar. "I need an emergency protective order. Boyd Hughes just confronted me in my office. He may have been armed." Within hours, a temporary protective order was in place. The police conducted a welfare check at Boyd's motel room, but reported he had already checked out. "We'll patrol near your residence tonight," the officer assured Leroy. "But you might want to consider staying elsewhere until we locate him." Leroy arranged for the children to stay with Dwayne and his wife for the night, then returned home to gather some essentials. As he was packing a bag, the doorbell rang. Checking the security camera, Leroy was stunned to see Vanessa standing on his porch. He opened the door cautiously. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "You're supposed to be in Phoenix." Vanessa looked terrible, thin, with dark circles under her eyes and a haunted expression. "Boyd called me," she said without preamble. He's completely unhinged, Leroy. He threatened to hurt you and take the kids. Leroy's blood ran cold. When did he call you? About an hour ago, Vanessa replied, shivering despite the warm evening. He said he was going to make you pay, that he'd take everything from you like you took everything from him. The children are safe, Leroy assured her, surprised by her apparent concern. They're with Dwayne. Come inside. Once in the living room, Vanessa seemed to collapse in on herself. This is all my fault, she whispered. I let him into our lives. I believe his lies. And now he's threatening our children. The police are looking for him, Leroy said. There's a protective order in place. Vanessa laughed bitterly. A piece of paper won't stop him. You didn't hear him, Leroy. He's lost everything. He has nothing left to lose. Why come warn me? Leroy asked, studying her carefully. Why not just call? Because I needed you to believe me, Vanessa said simply. After everything, I know you have no reason to trust anything I say. But this is about our children. Before Leroy could respond, his phone rang. It was Marla. Hughes just checked into the Sunset Motel, 2 miles from your house, she reported. And he purchased a handgun 3 days ago at a pawn shop in Nevada. Legal sale, but concerning given his current state. Leroy's decision was immediate. Call the police. Tell them everything you know. He hung up and turned to Vanessa. Boyd has a gun. The police are being notified. Fear flashed across Vanessa's face. Oh God, what have I done? Bringing him into our lives, near our children. You need to leave, Leroy told her. Go to a hotel. Go back to Phoenix. Just get away from here until Boyd is in custody. Vanessa shook her head. No, I'm done running from my mistakes. I'm going to the police station to make a statement about his threats. Maybe that will help them find him faster. Leroy was surprised by her resolve. I'll drive you. As they headed to Leroy's car, a vehicle turned sharply into the driveway, blocking them in. Boyd emerged, unsteady on his feet, a pistol in his hand. Well, isn't this touching? He slurred, gesturing with the gun. The happy couple, back together. Leroy pushed Vanessa behind him. Boyd put the gun down. The police are already on their way. Boyd laughed, a broken sound. Of course they are. You've thought of everything, haven't you, Leroy? Always one step ahead. This won't solve anything, Leroy said calmly, though his heart was pounding. You're just making things worse for yourself. Worse? Boyd's laugh turned hysterical. How could anything be worse? I lost my license, my business, my reputation. I'm living in flea-bag motels, working for minimum wage. And it's all because of you. No, Vanessa spoke up, stepping out from behind Leroy. It's because of me. I'll let you manipulate me. I betrayed my family for you. Leroy was just protecting what was his. Boyd's gaze shifted to Vanessa, his expression darkening. You're defending him now? After everything we had? We had nothing, Vanessa replied firmly. You used me to get what you wanted. You used my children. Boyd's hand tightened on the gun. Shut up. Both of you just shut up. Leroy tensed, ready to move if Boyd raised the weapon. But instead, Boyd seemed to deflate, the gun lowering slightly. I just wanted what you had, he said, his voice suddenly small. The perfect family, the nice house. Is that so wrong? You could have built your own life, Leroy replied. Instead, you tried to steal mine. In the distance, police sirens wailed. Boyd's head snapped up, panic replacing the brief vulnerability. No more talking, he snarled, raising the gun again. You took everything from me. Now I take something from you. Time seemed to slow as Boyd aimed the weapon. Leroy lunged forward, tackling Boyd just as the gun discharged. They crashed to the ground, wrestling for control of the weapon. Vanessa screamed, and then suddenly multiple police officers were there, shouting commands. Drop the weapon. Police. Boyd's resistance crumbled. The gun fell from his hand, and officers quickly secured him, pulling him away from Leroy. Are you hit? One officer asked Leroy, helping him to his feet. Leroy shook his head, breathing hard. No, we're okay. As Boyd was led to a police cruiser, he locked eyes with Leroy one last time. This isn't over, he called out. You'll never be free of me. Actually, it is over, Leroy replied calmly. Attempted murder with a firearm carries a minimum sentence of 20 years in this state. By the time you get out, Boyd, no one will even remember your name. Later, At the police station, after providing their statements, Leroy and Vanessa sat in silence in the waiting area. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving them both exhausted. "Thank you," Vanessa said finally, "for saving my life back there." Leroy nodded, but said nothing. "I know you'll never forgive me," she continued. "I don't expect you to, but I want you to know I regret everything. Not just because of how it turned out, but because of what I did to you and the children." Leroy studied her, seeing genuine remorse for the first time. "What happens now, Vanessa? You go back to Phoenix, back to supervised visitation?" She shook her head. "I'm moving back here, if I can find work. I want to be closer to the kids, even if it's just for supervised visits. My parents are selling their house anyway, downsizing for retirement. And if Boyd makes bail, he won't," Vanessa said confidently. The detective said the judge would deny bail given the circumstances. She hesitated, then added, "Even if he did, I'm done being afraid. I let fear and insecurity drive me into Boyd's arms. I won't make that mistake again." Something had shifted between them, not forgiveness. Leroy knew he would never fully forgive her betrayal, but perhaps a recognition that they would always be connected through their children. "I'll have Omar revise the custody agreement," he said finally. "If you're living locally, we can adjust the visitation schedule. Still supervised, but more frequent." Tears filled Vanessa's eyes. "Thank you. That's more than I deserve." Leroy stood, ready to leave. "You're right about that, but it's what the children deserve." As he walked away, Leroy felt a strange sense of closure. Boyd would face justice for his crimes. Vanessa had finally acknowledged her role in the destruction of their family. The systematic revenge Leroy had orchestrated had accomplished its purpose. But the true victory, he realized, wasn't in their downfall. It was in his own resilience, in rebuilding a life for himself and his children from the ashes of betrayal. The wheel of justice had come full circle. Chapter 9. Ashes and Embers. 1 year after Boyd's arrest, Leroy stood in his backyard, tending to the grill as Cody and Melissa played with their friends in the sprinkler. The summer evening was perfect, warm air cooling as the sun descended, the scent of charcoal and marinated chicken, children's laughter carrying across the lawn. "Need a hand with those?" Dwayne asked, approaching with 2 beers. Leroy accepted one gratefully. "Almost done." Kids worked up an appetite with all that running around. They stood in companionable silence, watching the children's antics. At 11, Cody was showing signs of the teenager he would soon become, while 9-year-old Melissa remained caught between childhood and the growing awareness of adolescence. "You've done a good job with them," Dwayne observed. "After everything they've been through." Leroy nodded, acknowledging the compliment. The past year had brought significant changes. Boyd had pleaded guilty to attempted murder and weapons charges, receiving a 25-year sentence with no possibility of parole for at least 18 years. The plea deal had spared everyone the trauma of a trial. Vanessa had indeed moved back to the area, finding work as an office manager at a dental practice. True to her word, she had focused on rebuilding her relationship with the children, never missing a supervised visitation and gradually earning back their trust. 3 months ago, the court had modified the visitation order, removing the supervision requirement while maintaining Leroy's primary custody. It had been his decision not to contest the change, a recognition that despite her failings, Vanessa was still their mother. "Trish says Vanessa's seeing someone new," Dwayne mentioned casually. "Some dentist from her practice. Taking it really slow, apparently." Leroy flipped the chicken, unconcerned. "Good for her. You're not worried about history repeating itself?" Dwayne asked. Leroy shook his head. "Vanessa learned her lesson the hard way. Besides, the custody agreement has safeguards now. No overnight visits with romantic partners while the children are present. No introducing partners to the kids without prior discussion." "And you? Any interest in dating again?" Dwayne pressed. "Renee seems to think highly of you." Leroy smiled slightly. "Renee and I are friends. She's still recovering from her own Boyd experience." "Not everyone is Vanessa or Boyd," Dwayne pointed out. "Some people are actually decent." "I know," Leroy acknowledged. "But I'm focused on the kids right now. They've had enough change and turmoil." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Omar and his wife, bearing side dishes for the barbecue. Soon the backyard was filled with friends, colleagues, and neighbors enjoying the summer evening. Leroy moved among them, the gracious host, but part of him remained detached, observing. He had rebuilt his life piece by piece. A new home, strengthened friendships, career success, and most importantly, a solid foundation with his children. The rage that had driven him to systematically destroy Boyd and Vanessa had burned itself out, leaving behind a cooler, more calculated perspective. Later, after the guests had departed and the children were in bed, Leroy sat alone on the back porch, nursing a final beer. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Opening it, he felt a jolt of surprise. "Thank you for allowing the visitation change. The kids seem happier. I know I don't deserve your consideration, but I appreciate it. V." Leroy stared at the message for a long moment before responding. "I didn't do it for you. I did it for them." Her reply came quickly. "I know. That's why you're a better parent than I ever was. I'm trying to learn from your example." Leroy didn't respond, but he didn't delete the message either. It represented something he hadn't expected. Acknowledgement from Vanessa that her betrayal had been wrong, not just because of the consequences she suffered, but because of the pain it caused. The following weekend, when he dropped the children off for their visit with Vanessa, he actually exchanged a few civil words with her. Not friendly, not warm, but not openly hostile either. "Cody has a science project due Tuesday," he informed her. "He's got the materials, but he'll need to work on it this weekend." Vanessa nodded. "I'll make sure he has time. We can work on it together tomorrow." An awkward pause followed. Then Vanessa said, "I've been meaning to ask. Melissa's birthday is next month. I know it falls on my weekend, but I was thinking we could do a joint celebration. Something small at the park, maybe, so she doesn't have to choose between us." The old Leroy would have refused outright, seeing it as Vanessa trying to insert herself back into his life. But the man he'd become recognized that this wasn't about him or Vanessa. It was about Melissa. "That makes sense," he said finally. "Let me know what you're thinking, and we'll coordinate." The relief on Vanessa's face was evident. "Thank you." As he drove away, Leroy reflected on the journey of the past 2 years. From the devastating discovery of betrayal to the cold, methodical execution of revenge, and finally to this point. Not forgiveness, never that, but perhaps a kind of detached peace. Boyd remained in prison, his attempts to appeal his sentence denied. According to the last update Leroy had received, he'd become a model prisoner, participating in therapy and educational programs. It meant nothing to Leroy. Boyd had made his choices and would live with the consequences for decades to come. Vanessa continued her efforts to rebuild her relationship with the children, accepting the limitations Leroy imposed without complaint. She would never again be the woman he had married, never again hold his trust or affection. But for the children's sake, he could maintain a civil coexistence. That evening, Leroy received an unexpected visitor. Renee Simmons stood on his doorstep, a bottle of wine in hand. "Thought you might want some company," she said with a slight smile. The first quiet weekend after the kids start visitation is always the hardest. Leroy raised an eyebrow. "Speaking from experience?" "My daughter visits her father every other weekend," Renee confirmed. 5 years post-divorce, and I still hate the silence when she's gone. He invited her in, appreciating her straightforward manner. They developed an unusual friendship in the aftermath of the Boyd situation. Two people who understood what it meant to be betrayed, to seek justice, and to rebuild. "How's the fraud case going?" Leroy asked as he poured the wine. Renee shrugged. "The judgment is just paper at this point. Boyd has nothing to pay with, and won't for decades. But it was never really about the money." "No," Leroy agreed. "It was about making sure he couldn't do it again." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Renee spoke again. "You know, I admire how you've handled all this. The revenge was thorough." She smiled slightly. "But you've moved beyond it. Some people get stuck in that phase, letting the bitterness consume them." "Who says I've moved beyond it?" Leroy challenged, though without heat. "The fact that you're allowing Vanessa more time with the kids," Renee pointed out. "The man consumed by revenge wouldn't do that." Leroy considered her words. "I haven't forgiven her, if that's what you're suggesting." "I'm not suggesting anything," Renee replied. Just observing that you've prioritized your children's well-being over punishing their mother. That takes strength. Later, after Renee had gone, Leroy found himself reflecting on her observation. Had he moved beyond revenge? The cold satisfaction he'd once felt at Vanessa and Boyd's downfall had faded, replaced by something more complex. Not forgiveness. He would never forgive their betrayal, but perhaps a recognition that continuing to actively punish them served no purpose. The damage had been done. Justice, in its own way, had been served. Boyd would spend decades in prison. Vanessa had lost her marriage, her home, her reputation, and full access to her children. The systematic revenge Leroy had orchestrated had accomplished its purpose. Now, his focus was on building something new from the ashes of betrayal. A life centered on his children, his career, and the relationships with people who had proven their loyalty during the darkest times. The final test came 6 months later, when Vanessa requested a modification to the custody arrangement. She had been offered a significant promotion that would require occasional travel and asked for more flexibility in the visitation schedule. Omar advised against it. We have the upper hand legally. There's no need to accommodate her career advancement. But Leroy found himself considering a different perspective. The promotion means better financial security for the children, he pointed out. And Vanessa has been consistent with visitation, following all the court's guidelines. Are you actually defending her? Omar asked, surprised. No, Leroy said firmly. I'm being practical. The children benefit from her financial stability. And they're older now. Cody's almost 13. They understand the situation better. In the end, Leroy agreed to a modified schedule that allowed for some flexibility while maintaining his primary custody. It wasn't a concession to Vanessa, but a decision made in the best interests of Cody and Melissa. When he informed Vanessa of his decision, she seemed genuinely touched. Thank you, Leroy. This means a lot. Don't mistake this for forgiveness, he said, his voice hard. I will never forgive what you and Boyd did. Never. Vanessa's expression sobered. I know. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. No, you don't, Leroy agreed. But the children deserve parents who can at least be civil to each other. As the years passed, Leroy maintained this position. He never forgave Vanessa's betrayal, never fully trusted her again, never allowed himself to be vulnerable to her manipulation. But for the sake of the children, he established a detached, business-like coexistence. Boyd occasionally sent letters from prison, seeking forgiveness or understanding. Leroy returned them unopened. Some betrayals were beyond redemption, beyond forgiveness. Boyd had tried to steal everything from him, his family, his home, his identity as a father. Such actions could never be forgiven. 5 years after the divorce, at Cody's middle school graduation, Leroy found himself standing next to Vanessa as they watched their son receive an academic achievement award. He's so much like you, Vanessa observed quietly. That same determination, Leroy nodded,